My sister took me to court to steal $3.8 million from me. She told the judge my sister is sick. She has been mentally ill for years. My mother started crying and nodded along. Then the judge asked if they actually knew who I really was. The courtroom went silent. Their faces turned pale. My name is Diana. I am 33 years old, and my family just tried to legally hijack my entire life. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who underestimated your worth. The Thanksgiving dinner was supposed to be a rare moment of peace. We were seated in a private dining room at one of the most exclusive steakhouses in downtown Chicago. The room smelled of roasted turkey, expensive truffles, and rich red wine. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm golden glow over the immaculate white tablecloth. From the outside, anyone looking through the glass double doors would have seen a picture-perfect family enjoying a holiday meal. My father, Thomas, sat at the head of the table in his tailored suit. My mother, Linda, wore her signature pearls and a practiced smile. Across from me sat my older sister, Courtney, and her husband, Derek, the wealthy real estate executive whom my parents adored. I was the odd one out, or at least that was the narrative they had maintained for the past decade. I was quietly enjoying my meal, listening to Courtney boast about her latest country club event and Derek's booming real estate ventures. I nodded along, offering polite smiles, intentionally keeping my own life out of the conversation. I had learned long ago that sharing my achievements only invited their mockery. To them, I was still the fragile girl who could not handle the pressure of law school, the one who had a breakdown 10 years ago and locked herself in her childhood bedroom for a month. They never let me forget it. Every family gathering involved some thinly veiled comment about my mental state or my supposed inability to function in the real world. I was mid-bite of my mashed potatoes when the atmosphere in the room abruptly shifted. The polite chatter ceased. Courtney reached down into her designer tote bag and pulled out a massive, heavy stack of papers. Without a word of warning, she violently slammed the 50-page legal binder directly onto my plate. The impact was so forceful that it rattled the heavy silverware and shattered the crystal wine glass sitting next to my hand. Dark red wine exploded across the pristine white tablecloth, splashing onto my lap and staining the fabric of my cream-colored dress. The sudden noise echoed off the wood-paneled walls of the private dining room. I froze my fork suspended in the air, watching the red liquid seep into the heavy paper of the binder. "Sign it," Courtney demanded. Her voice was sharp, lacking any trace of the sweet conversational tone she had been using moments before. I slowly lowered my fork and looked down at the document. The bold black letters at the top of the first page read, "Petition for Emergency Conservatorship." My heart gave a single hard thump against my ribs, but I kept my face entirely blank. I picked up a cloth napkin and began methodically dabbing at the wine stain on my dress, refusing to give them the reaction they were clearly waiting for. "What is this, Courtney?" I asked, my voice dangerously quiet and perfectly level. "Do not play dumb with us, Diana," she sneered, leaning across the table. Her eyes were wide with a frantic, greedy energy. "We know about the account. We found the bank statements you tried to hide. $3.8 million. You have $3.8 million sitting in a private account, and you thought you could keep it a secret from your own family." I continued to dab at my dress, my movements slow and deliberate. The account they were referring to was a decoy, a secondary financial holding I rarely thought about, but the fact that they had been digging through my mail or hiring investigators to look into my finances was a massive violation of my privacy. "That is my personal money," I said evenly. "I fail to see how my bank balance is any of your concern, let alone grounds for a legal petition." "Because you are completely unfit to manage that kind of wealth," Courtney snapped, her voice rising in pitch. She reached across the table and jabbed her manicured finger against the wet cover of the binder. "You are sick, Diana. You have been sick for 10 years. You are mentally unstable, paranoid, and completely incapable of handling $3.8 million. You are going to blow it all on some manic episode or get scammed by someone who realizes how weak your mind is. We are stepping in to protect you from yourself." I looked at Derek, who was staring fixedly at his plate, sweating slightly under the collar of his expensive shirt. I looked at my father, whose jaw was clenched tightly, his eyes dark and calculating. They had planned this ambush perfectly. They chose Thanksgiving, a holiday centered around family and gratitude, to spring a legal trap designed to strip me of my autonomy. This conservatorship hands full financial and medical control over to me and Mom. Courtney continued pulling a gold-plated pen from her purse and tossing it onto the table. It landed with a sharp clatter right next to the spilled wine. You will sign over the rights to the account today. We will manage the money, make sure your bills are paid, and ensure you get the psychiatric help you so desperately need. It is for your own good. I stared at the gold pen. The sheer audacity of their plan was almost impressive. They were using a decade-old period of severe depression brought on by their own relentless emotional abuse to label me as mentally incompetent today. They wanted to take my money and lock me in a legal cage, stripping me of every right I had as an adult woman. I did not scream. I did not cry. I did not throw the wine back in her face, though the temptation was certainly there. Instead, I carefully folded my stained napkin, placed it neatly beside my ruined plate, and looked Courtney dead in the eye. I am not signing anything, I said, my voice completely devoid of emotion. And you are out of your mind if you think a judge will grant a conservatorship based on a panic attack I had when I was 23 years old. The silence in the room grew heavy, suffocating. Courtney's confident smirk faltered for a fraction of a second before twisting into an ugly scowl. You really think you have a choice here? My mother Linda suddenly intervened. Linda stood up from her chair scraping loudly against the hardwood floor. Her face was flushed with manufactured outrage, her eyes wide and staring. She pointed a trembling finger directly at my face, stepping fully into her role as the long-suffering, desperate mother. Do not you dare act like you are in control of the situation. Diana, my mother hissed, her voice vibrating with a vicious intensity I had not heard in years. We have suffered enough of your crazy behavior. We have walked on eggshells around you for a decade, pretending you are normal, pretending you are not a broken, defective mess. We are not asking for your permission anymore. We are taking over. I looked up at her, maintaining my stoic expression, though a cold knot was forming in my stomach. The level of malice in her eyes was chilling. If you refuse to pick up that pen and sign those papers right now, my mother continued, her finger still pointing at me like a weapon, I will pull out my phone and call the authorities this very second. I will tell them my deeply disturbed daughter is having a violent psychotic breakdown in a public restaurant. I will tell them you are a danger to yourself and to us. I will have you strapped to a gurney, pumped full of sedatives, and locked inside a psychiatric ward before they even serve dessert. You will lose your freedom tonight, Diana. So pick up the pen and sign the damn papers. The shrill pitch of my mother's voice hung in the stagnant air of the private dining room. I looked at her flushed cheeks and the way her expensive pearl necklace heaved with every ragged breath she took. This was a performance. It was the exact same theatrical display of maternal martyrdom she had perfected over the last 30 years. She wanted me to react. She wanted me to raise my voice, to cry, to throw my hands up in defense so she could point to my distress as proof of my instability. I simply set the stained napkin on the table and folded my hands in my lap. You are referencing a brief period of depression I experienced 10 years ago, I said, keeping my tone entirely conversational. A decade has passed since I left law school. I have lived on my own, supported myself, and never asked you for a single dime. My mother let out a loud, mocking laugh that sounded more like a bark. You call hiding in your childhood bedroom for an entire month just a brief period of depression. You were completely non-functional. We had to bring trays of food to your door like you were an invalid. You could not handle the basic pressure of your first semester of law school, and you completely cracked. You have always been the broken child in this family. Courtney leaned forward, resting her elbows on the table, her eyes glittering with malicious delight. Mom is right, Diana. You have never lived in reality. While you were busy feeling sorry for yourself and playing the victim, I was out building a real life. I married Derek. I helped him grow his real estate empire into one of the most successful firms in Chicago. I gave Mom and Dad grandchildren. I am the one who holds this family together. You just float around the city living in some fantasy world. I glanced at Derek. He was gripping his fork so tightly his knuckles were white. He was staring intensely at the remains of his turkey, completely avoiding my gaze. He was a wealthy CEO, a man who commanded boardrooms, yet here he sat sweating nervously while his wife and mother-in-law berated me. It was a bizarre dynamic. You think a judge is going to hand over $3.8 million to someone who spent a month crying in bed 10 years ago, I asked. That is not how the legal system works. My mother slammed her palm flat against the mahogany table. It is exactly how the system works when your own family testifies against you. We have kept your dirty little secrets for years, Diana. We protected you from the judgment of our friends. But we are done protecting you. We are going to tell the judge about every single therapy session you went to. We will tell the court how you refused to answer our calls for weeks at a time. We will paint a picture of a deeply disturbed, paranoid woman who is entirely disconnected from reality. The chilling part was not just what she was saying, but how she was saying it. There was no hesitation, no guilt, no maternal conflict. My own mother was eagerly planning to weaponize my past trauma. The very depression they had caused with their relentless, suffocating expectations was now being used as a legal tool to strip me of my rights. I sat back in my chair and looked at the three of them. The realization washed over me slowly, bringing with it a wave of icy clarity. This was not a spontaneous argument over a holiday dinner. This was a highly coordinated, premeditated ambush. The 50-page legal binder sitting on my plate had not been drafted overnight. Courtney and Derek must have hired lawyers weeks ago. They had illegally dug into my financial records somehow, finding that specific decoy account, and they had spent countless hours plotting the perfect moment to trap me. They chose Thanksgiving because they knew I would be alone with them in a closed room away from the public eye where they could exert maximum pressure. You planned this, I stated, my voice steady. You invited me here specifically to back me into a corner. Of course we did. My father Thomas finally spoke. His voice was deep, gravelly, and carried an undeniable undertone of menace. He pushed his chair back and stood up. He was a large man, and he used his physical presence to intimidate everyone around him. He slowly walked around the edge of the large circular table until he was standing directly behind my chair. I felt the heavy, imposing weight of him hovering over my shoulder. "We are doing what is necessary," Thomas said, his voice dropping to a dangerous register. "We are not going to let you squander millions of dollars while your sister actually contributes to society. You do not deserve that kind of wealth. You do not even know what to do with it. Courtney and Derek have real investments, real responsibilities. That money belongs in capable hands." I tilted my head back slightly to look at him. "So this is just a robbery then? You are using a fraudulent conservatorship to steal my money and funnel it to Derek. Do not use that word," Thomas snapped, leaning down so his face was inches from mine. "It is not stealing, it is asset management, and you are going to give us the authority to manage it right now. And if I refuse, I challenged him." Thomas stood up to his full height and crossed his arms over his broad chest. "If you refuse, I will pull out my phone and call Captain Miller at the 9th Precinct. We play golf every Sunday. I will tell him my daughter is having a severe manic episode and is a danger to herself. I will tell him you are threatening violence. He will send a squad car here in 5 minutes. They will place you under an involuntary psychiatric hold. You will spend the rest of the holiday weekend locked in a sterile white room pumped full of sedatives surrounded by actual lunatics." A cold shiver ran down my spine. I knew my father was not making an idle threat. He thrived on using his connections to manipulate the system. He would absolutely call his police buddies, and they would absolutely take his word over mine. He was a respected, wealthy businessman in the community, and I was the daughter they had already painted as unstable. Once I was locked in a psychiatric ward, even for a 72-hour hold, Courtney's lawyer would use that institutionalization as the ultimate proof for the conservatorship. The legal trap would snap shut, and my signature would no longer even be required. "You would do that to your own daughter?" I asked, searching his eyes for any trace of parental instinct. I found nothing but cold, calculating greed. "I will do whatever it takes to secure this family's future," Thomas replied flatly. "Your sister needs that capital for her business ventures. You are just being selfish. Now, for the last time, pick up the pen." I looked from my father to my mother, who was watching me with a triumphant, expectant smile. I looked at Courtney, who was practically bouncing in her seat with excitement. I looked at the ruined plate of food, the spilled red wine, and the heavy legal binder sitting in the mess. They honestly believed they had me completely cornered. They believed I was still the terrified, broken 23-year-old girl who cried in her room. They had no idea that the woman sitting in front of them had spent the last decade building a mind as impenetrable as a fortress. I reached out my hand toward the gold-plated pen resting on the table. Courtney's smile widened into a full grin. My mother let out a loud sigh of relief, clearly pleased that her aggressive tactics had broken my spirit one more time. My fingers hovered over the pen for a fraction of a second. Then in one swift, fluid motion, I grabbed my designer purse from the empty chair beside me. I pushed my own chair back so forcefully that it screeched against the polished hardwood floor, the loud noise slicing through the quiet tension of the room. I stood up, smoothing the wrinkles from my blazer, completely ignoring the wine stain on my dress. "I am not signing your papers, and I am not staying for the rest of this pathetic performance," I said, turning my back on the table. "You can mail the bill for the turkey to my office." I took exactly 2 steps toward the exit before my father moved. He lunged forward with surprising speed and planted his large frame directly in front of the heavy wooden double doors of the private dining room. He spread his arms wide, his face turning a deep shade of crimson. His eyes narrowed into furious slits, stripping away any remaining facade of a civilized family dinner. "You are not going anywhere," Thomas growled, his voice echoing loudly off the wood-paneled walls. "Nobody is leaving this room until the ink is dry on those papers." Thomas stood like a brick wall, his chest heaving with exertion, fully expecting me to cower. 10 years ago, the sheer volume of his voice and the physical space he deliberately consumed would have sent me spiraling into a debilitating panic attack. I would have collapsed back into my chair, hyperventilating and begging for their approval. But that fragile version of me was dead buried under years of intensive therapy, relentless professional hard work, and a realization that my family's power over me was entirely fabricated. I looked at his broad shoulders, then down at his expensive Italian leather shoes. He had planted his feet wide, a classic intimidation stance meant to trap me against the table, but his balance was entirely front-loaded, making him rigid and slow to react. I did not say a single word. I did not try to reason with a man who had just threatened to have me locked in a psychiatric ward for financial gain. Instead, I took a half step to my left, finding a sudden movement back toward the dining chairs. As Thomas predictably shifted his heavy weight to block my perceived retreat, I swiftly pivoted to my right. I slipped past his shoulder in a fluid motion, the silk fabric of my ruined dress brushing lightly against his suit jacket. He let out a startled grunt, stumbling slightly as his momentum betrayed him. Before he could recover his balance or grab my arm to restrain me, I pushed down the brass handle of the double doors and stepped out of the private dining room. The sudden shift in atmosphere was jarring. The tense silence of the private room was instantly replaced by the clinking of silverware, the low hum of polite conversation, and the soft jazz playing in the main dining area. I walked briskly past the startled hostess, keeping my posture perfectly straight, and ignoring the curious glances of other patrons who noticed the wine stain splashed across my light dress. My heart was beating a steady rhythmic drum against my ribs, but my mind was crystal clear and devoid of panic. I pushed through the revolving glass doors of the restaurant and stepped out onto the pavement. The freezing Chicago wind hit me like a physical blow, instantly biting through the thin fabric of my tailored blazer. I welcomed the shock of the cold. It was intensely grounding, a harsh contrast to the suffocating heat of my family's delusions. I walked down the sidewalk of River North, my heels clicking sharply against the icy concrete. The city was alive with holiday energy. The street trees were wrapped in twinkling white lights, and groups of people hurried past, carrying shopping bags, laughing together, bundled in wool coats and scarves. The absolute normalcy of the world around me helped wash away the sickness of the restaurant. I did not look back to see if Thomas or Derek had followed me outside. I knew they would not risk causing a scene in public, Not where Derek's business associates might be dining, and not where my mother's carefully crafted social image could be tarnished by a shouting match. I walked for 3 long blocks, purposefully putting enough physical distance between myself and the steakhouse to ensure absolute privacy. The wind was picking up rapidly, swirling off the Chicago River and cutting straight to my bones. I ducked into the recessed entryway of a closed boutique to escape the worst of the wind chill. The initial burst of adrenaline that had propelled me out of the restaurant was beginning to recede, leaving behind a sharp, focused need to execute my next move and simply get home. I reached into my purse and pulled out my phone, intent on ordering a premium rideshare to take me back to my warm apartment. I opened the app, typed in my home address, and selected the black car option. The screen displayed a loading circle for a few seconds before a gray error message popped up stating that my primary payment method had been declined. I frowned, dismissing the notification and tapping the screen to select a different credit card linked to my account. The exact same error message appeared immediately. A slight prickle of unease finally touched the back of my neck. I closed the rideshare app entirely and opened my primary personal banking application. I typed in my secure passcode and waited for the dashboard to load. The screen refreshed, but instead of displaying my standard checking and savings account balances, the entire background of the application was dominated by a glaring red banner. Account frozen. I stared at the bold white letters, my thumb hovering motionless over the glass screen. I tried to tap on my checking account details to see the transaction history, but the screen was completely locked. A generic automated message below the red banner advised me to contact my financial institution during regular business hours for more information. It was Thanksgiving evening. The banks would not be open until Monday morning. They had timed this financial strike with absolute ruthless precision. As I stood in the freezing entryway staring at the locked banking screen, my phone vibrated intensely in my palm. A text message notification dropped down from the top of the screen. The sender was Courtney. I opened the message thread. There was no text accompanying the message, just a high-resolution photograph of a legal document. I pinched the screen to zoom in my eyes, scanning the dense, formal legal jargon printed on the page. It was a temporary court injunction officially freezing all personal financial assets associated with my name and social security number. I looked at the top right corner of the document. The filing date stamp indicated it had been processed and signed late Wednesday afternoon, mere hours before the courts closed for the 4-day holiday weekend. My eyes dropped to the bottom of the page, searching for the legal justification. The order had been granted under the guise of an emergency medical freeze. The petition falsely claimed that I was experiencing a severe undiagnosed psychological episode and was at immediate risk of draining my accounts or falling victim to financial exploitation due to mental incapacitation. I stared at the signature of the judge who had signed the emergency order. Judge Robert Harrison. The name was instantly familiar to me. He was a notoriously corrupt local official who frequently attended Derek's expensive charity galas and golfed at the same exclusive country club as my father. Derek had clearly used his massive influence and deep pockets to bypass standard legal procedures, securing an emergency injunction without me ever being notified, evaluated, or given a chance to defend myself. They had successfully severed my access to my personal funds, effectively stranding me in the middle of the city on a freezing holiday night with no access to a single dollar. A second vibration buzzed against my cold palm. I watched as another text bubble from Courtney popped up directly below the image of the fraudulent court order. I read the vicious words, feeling a quiet sense of calm wash over me. She honestly believed she had won. She believed she had stripped me of my power, my money, and my dignity. She thought she had reduced me to the helpless, broken girl I used to be. Courtney sends a mocking follow-up text. Have fun sleeping on the streets, psycho. See you at the hearing on Monday. I stared at the glowing screen of my phone, reading Courtney's mocking text one more time. Have fun sleeping on the streets, psycho. See you at the hearing on Monday. I locked the screen and slipped the phone deep into my coat pocket. The freezing wind whipped through the downtown streets, biting at my exposed legs and tearing through the thin fabric of my blazer. I did not shiver. The icy air felt entirely appropriate for the absolute clarity settling over my mind. I looked across the street and saw the towering illuminated facade of the Grand Monarch Hotel. It was a five-star luxury establishment known for its opulent architecture and discreet high-end clientele. Without a second thought, I stepped off the curb and walked toward the grand entrance, my heels clicking a steady, unhurried rhythm on the freezing pavement. The massive revolving glass doors glided open, and a wave of rich, warm air washed over me. The lobby was a sanctuary of polished marble, soaring ceilings, and the faint scent of fresh lilies and cedar wood. A string quartet played softly in a distant corner. I walked straight toward the front desk, feeling the plush carpet muffle my footsteps. A young man in a pristine uniform stood behind the marble counter, his posture perfectly straight. Before I could even open my mouth to speak, the revolving doors behind me spun with a frantic, aggressive energy. I heard the sharp, frantic clatter of high heels hitting the marble floor, followed immediately by my mother's breathless voice. I turned my head just a fraction of an inch. Courtney and Linda were marching across the lobby. They had actually followed me. They had jumped into a taxi right outside the steakhouse and trailed me through the freezing city purely to watch me hit rock bottom. Courtney's face was flushed with adrenaline and a twisted, triumphant glee. She pushed past a wealthy couple waiting for the concierge and marched directly up to the front desk, stepping right into my personal space. Linda flanked her, clutching her designer coat tightly around her shoulders, her eyes darting around the luxurious lobby, as if looking for an audience. Courtney did not even look at me. She slammed her hand down on the smooth marble counter, startling the young receptionist. "Listen to me very carefully," Courtney said to the young man, her voice loud and carrying easily over the soft music playing in the background. She reached into her purse, pulled out a crumpled $20 bill, and slapped it down on the counter. "This woman standing next to me is completely delusional. She is experiencing a severe psychiatric episode. She has no money, her accounts are frozen, and she is a vagrant, looking for a place to crash. I am paying you to call security right now and have her thrown back out onto the street where she belongs." The receptionist blinked, his eyes darting between the $20 bill, Courtney's flushed, angry face, and my perfectly calm expression. He shifted uncomfortably, clearing his throat. "Ma'am, please lower your voice," he said politely. "I am assisting this guest." Courtney let out a sharp, mocking laugh. "Guest? She is not a guest. She is a psycho who just ran away from her family, because we are trying to get her committed. Do your job and kick her out before she starts hallucinating in your precious lobby." Linda chimed in, nodding eagerly. "She is dangerous, young man. You really need to have her removed immediately for the safety of everyone here." I completely ignored them. I did not turn my head, I did not defend myself, and I did not acknowledge their pathetic attempt to humiliate me in public. I kept my gaze fixed warmly on the receptionist. I reached into my purse. I slipped my fingers past my wallet, past my keys, and felt for a tiny hidden zipper sewn discreetly into the inner lining. I unzipped the secret compartment and pulled out a solid, heavy metal card. It was matte black, completely devoid of any bank logo, bright colors, or personal name. It was a corporate master account card, issued exclusively to the highest echelon of executive leadership at my firm. I placed the heavy metal card onto the marble counter. It landed with a soft, authoritative thud that made the receptionist look down instantly. "I need the penthouse suite," I told him, my voice smooth and perfectly pleasant. "I will be staying for the entire month. Please run the initial deposit and set up an open tab for any incidentals." Courtney scoffed loudly, leaning over to look at the card. "What is that? A fake credit card you bought online? You are so pathetic, Diana. I just told you her accounts are completely frozen. She is legally destitute." "Run the card," I said to the receptionist, ignoring my sister's screeching entirely. The young man picked up the heavy metal card, his fingers lingering on the cold, solid material. He swiped it through the card reader on his terminal and began typing rapidly on his keyboard. He looked at his screen, then looked at the card, then typed something else. The amount for a month in the penthouse suite, plus the initial security deposit, was $15,000. Courtney crossed her arms over her chest and tapped her foot, wearing a smug, waiting expression. She was fully expecting the machine to decline the transaction. She was waiting for the red flashing light, for the moment I would be publicly denied and escorted out by security. The terminal sat in silence for 2 agonizingly long seconds. Then a soft, cheerful green chime echoed from the machine. Approved. The receptionist's eyes widened fractionally. He looked at his monitor, then looked up at me with a sudden profound shift in his posture. He stood a little taller, his expression morphing into one of absolute deferential respect. "Your transaction has been approved, madam," he said smoothly. "I will have the keys to the penthouse brought down immediately." Courtney let out a sound that was half gasp, half shriek. "Approved. That is impossible." Her voice echoed sharply through the elegant lobby, causing several guests sitting in the lounge area to turn and stare. She lunged forward, pointing a shaking finger at the credit card machine. "Run it again. That has to be a mistake. Her accounts are frozen by a federal judge. I have the paperwork right here on my phone." Linda grabbed Courtney's arm, looking around nervously at the people staring at them, but Courtney shook her off. "She is a thief." Courtney screamed at the receptionist, her face contorting with rage. "That card must be stolen. There is no name on it. She stole someone else's credit card, and you just processed a fraudulent charge. Call the police right now. She is a criminal. She is stealing $15,000. I stood perfectly still, watching my sister completely lose her grip on reality. Her volume had reached a hysterical pitch. The receptionist quickly picked up the heavy black card and held it behind the counter, looking deeply alarmed by Courtney's erratic behavior. "Ma'am, I need you to step back from the desk," the receptionist said firmly. Before Courtney could launch into another screaming fit, the heavy mahogany door behind the reception desk swung open. A tall, distinguished man in a perfectly tailored dark suit hurried out. He had silver hair and the sharp, observant eyes of someone who managed million-dollar crises on a daily basis. He was the general manager of the Grand Monarch. He stepped up to the counter, his brow furrowed in concern over the loud disturbance in his usually tranquil lobby. "What seems to be the problem here?" he asked the receptionist, his voice low and authoritative. Courtney immediately rounded on him. "The problem is that your employee just accepted a stolen credit card from my psychotic sister. I demand that you call the police and have her arrested. She is a danger to society and a thief." The general manager did not look at Courtney. His eyes scanned the desk, noted the heavy metal black card resting by the keyboard, and then he looked directly at me. The moment his eyes locked onto my face, all the tension drained from his posture. He recognized me. His firm managed several highly sensitive cybersecurity contracts, and I had personally overseen the auditing of their entire global network 2 years ago. He stepped out from behind the reception desk and walked directly toward me, completely ignoring Courtney's hysterical ranting. He stopped 2 feet away, placed his hands formally in front of him, and gave me a slight, highly respectful bow. "Good evening, Madam CEO," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the quiet lobby. "It is an absolute honor to have you staying with us again. I apologize for the delay with your penthouse suite." Courtney's mouth dropped open. The color instantly drained from her flushed face, leaving her looking pale and sickly. She stared at the general manager as if he had just spoken in a foreign language. Linda gripped the edge of the marble counter, her eyes wide with uncomprehending shock. The general manager turned his head slowly, looking at Courtney and Linda with an expression of utter freezing disdain. He did not raise his voice, but his tone was like cracking ice. He raised a hand and snapped his fingers sharply. 2 large men in dark suits immediately stepped out from the shadows near the elevator banks and walked swiftly toward us. "Security," the general manager commanded, his eyes locked on my sister. "These 2 individuals are trespassing and harassing our most valued guest. Remove them from my property immediately." The heavy mahogany doors of the elevator slid shut, cutting off the sound of Courtney's shrieks, echoing across the marble lobby. I leaned back against the mirrored wall of the private car, feeling the smooth, silent hum of the machinery, lifting me toward the top floor. My heart rate, which had remained steady during the confrontation, finally slowed to a relaxed, rhythmic beat. Stepping out into the private foyer of the penthouse, the silence was absolute. I unlocked the double doors and pushed them open, stepping into a sprawling expanse of floor-to-ceiling glass white leather and brushed steel. The Chicago skyline spread out before me, an endless ocean of glittering lights. I walked over to the entryway table, set down my purse, and slipped off my ruined blazer, tossing the wine-stained fabric over the back of a chair. It was a small casualty for the immense relief of finally being out of their suffocating presence. I walked through the massive living space, past the grand piano and the marble fireplace, heading straight for the master suite. I cared about the absolute privacy and the impenetrable security it offered. Sitting at the solid oak desk facing the windows, I reached into the hidden compartment of my purse one more time and pulled out my encrypted laptop. It was a highly specialized machine, devoid of brand logos, built entirely for secure federal communications. I opened the lid, bypassed the biometric scanners, and accessed my private network. I pulled up my actual financial dashboard, bypassing the frozen retail banking application entirely. The $3.8 million my family had discovered was not personal savings, nor was it the true measure of my wealth. It was a segregated emergency reserve belonging to Apex Forensics, maintained under my authority as the company's sole owner and primary signatory. The fund existed to cover protected client disbursements, payroll continuity, and critical operations if our standard banking network was ever compromised. For security reasons, the reserve was held through a separate institution and appeared externally under my name, but the ownership records clearly identified Apex Forensics as the beneficial owner. Freezing it temporarily inconvenienced me. Transferring it into a family trust, however, would amount to the theft of protected corporate capital and expose everyone involved to serious federal charges. My family believed they had discovered the full extent of my resources. In reality, they had placed their hands on one heavily monitored compartment of a company worth hundreds of millions of dollars. They had no idea they had barely scratched the paint on the armor I had spent the last decade building. When I walked away from their toxic household 10 years ago, I had channeled every ounce of my supposed mental instability into relentless focus. I built an empire. I founded Apex Forensics, a specialized cybersecurity and financial auditing firm that focused on tracking dark money and unraveling complex corporate fraud. Over the years, my client list had grown from desperate small business owners to elite federal agencies. The Department of Defense, the Securities and Exchange Commission, and international banking conglomerates relied on my firm to locate missing assets. Apex Forensics was currently valued at over $600 million, and I owned it outright. My family saw a fragile college dropout who needed heavy medication. The federal government saw a tactical weapon they could deploy against white-collar criminals. I kept my true identity completely hidden from my family, knowing exactly how they would try to exploit my success or tear it down. I picked up my phone, dialing a highly secure number untethered from the personal device Courtney had been messaging. The line rang only twice before a deep, familiar voice answered. "Diana, are you safe?" Daniel asked, his tone immediately shifting from professional to fiercely protective. Daniel was not just my fiancé. He was the lead legal counsel for Apex Forensics, a brilliant attorney who knew every legal loophole and trapdoor in the modern corporate world. We had met 5 years ago during a highly classified joint federal investigation, and he was the only person on earth who truly knew the depths of what I had survived to build my company. "I am safe," I replied, staring out at the sparkling city lights. "I am at the Grand Monarch in the penthouse." The dinner went exactly as we anticipated, only slightly more aggressive. They tried to execute an emergency conservatorship. Linda threatened to have me forcibly committed to a psychiatric ward, and Thomas tried to physically block me from leaving the restaurant. Daniel let out a low, dangerously quiet breath. And the decoy funds frozen, I confirmed. Courtney sent me a picture of the injunction. They managed to find a judge willing to sign a temporary medical freeze late on a holiday evening. Judge Robert Harrison. Daniel typed rapidly on his end of the line, the sharp clacking of keys echoing through the speaker. Harrison is extremely corrupt. We both know he takes kickbacks from local real estate developers. That means Derek definitely orchestrated the legal side of this ambush. They are moving much faster than we originally projected, Diana. If they are willing to openly commit perjury and fraud to seize your assets, they are truly desperate. People like your father and your brother-in-law do not risk federal prison unless they are completely backed into a corner. I entirely agree, I said, leaning forward and resting my elbows on the solid oak desk. This is not just about controlling me anymore. This is about money. They need that $3.8 million right now. I need you to find out why. I want a quiet, deep dive forensic trace on Derek's entire real estate portfolio. Do not trigger any alarms within his network. Just pull the public ledgers, track the shell companies, and monitor the offshore holding accounts. I want to see exactly where his cash flow is bleeding. Give me 10 minutes, Daniel said, his voice dropping into the cold, clinical tone he used when dismantling hostile corporate takeovers. I will call you right back. I ended the call and set the phone down gently on the desk. The penthouse was incredibly still. I walked over to the small kitchenette, poured myself a glass of cold, sparkling water, and drank it slowly to soothe my dry throat. My mind was racing, carefully connecting the pieces of this bizarre puzzle. Derek had always been remarkably flashy. He drove cars that cost more than most people's homes, wore bespoke suits, and threw lavish charity galas, just to ensure his name remained featured in local society pages. My parents blindly worshipped his superficial success, constantly comparing his outward ambition to my supposed pathetic failure. But in my line of work, extreme flashiness was almost always a smokescreen for unmanageable debt. You do not try to legally kidnap your sister-in-law and steal her savings unless the bank is knocking at your door. I walked back to the desk and stared intently at my encrypted laptop. The digital footprint of a man like Derek would undoubtedly be messy. Arrogant men always left a wide trail because they genuinely believed they were too smart to ever be caught. 10 minutes later, my phone vibrated heavily against the wood of the desk. I picked it up, pressing the speaker to my ear. "Did you find it?" I asked. The line remained silent for a long moment. When Daniel finally spoke, his voice lacked its usual steady confidence. There was a genuine, unmistakable edge of shock in his tone. "Diana, I ran the trace through our secondary algorithms to bypass his domestic firewalls. I was fully expecting to find a few over-leveraged commercial properties or a bad bridge loan with a high interest rate. I was definitely not expecting this." "What did you find?" I pressed my grip, tightening slightly on the phone. Daniel let out a slow, troubled exhale. "Diana, there is something deeply wrong inside Derek's corporate structure," he said. "I am seeing hidden liabilities, unexplained transfers, and several shell entities that do not appear to serve any legitimate business purpose. Someone has been moving capital away from his primary operating accounts and burying the transactions beneath inflated property valuations." "How large is the exposure?" I asked. "I cannot give you a reliable number yet," Daniel replied. "The domestic records have been deliberately fragmented, and several of the receiving entities terminate behind offshore privacy walls. What I can tell you is that Derek is under severe financial pressure, and the pressure appears recent. There is a deficit, but I need access to the main forensic system before I can determine its exact size or prove where the money went." I stared out across the Chicago skyline, feeling the first pieces of the ambush begin to align. Their attempt to seize my account had not been driven by concerned jealousy or even simple greed. Derek needed immediate liquidity, and my family had decided that sacrificing me was easier than admitting why. "Daniel, I need you to pull every transaction record associated with that deficit, trace the exact dates the money began disappearing, find out who his primary investors are. We need a complete financial map of his ruin before the courts open on Monday morning. I am compiling the data packets, Daniel replied. Diana, they have left a digital trail a mile wide. Derek might be a smooth talker in a boardroom, but his accounting practices are arrogant and sloppy. I will have a bulletproof dossier ready for the judge. We ended the call and I set the phone down. I walked toward the windows intending to finally take a breath, but my phone immediately began to vibrate. It was not the single buzz of an incoming call. It was a frantic series of rapidly delivered notifications. I turned back and picked up the device. I had received dozens of text messages, social media tags, and direct alerts. Courtney was furious about being humiliated and thrown out of the Grand Monarch Hotel. She decided to retaliate the only way she knew how. I opened the social media application I kept for maintaining appearances with distant relatives. Courtney had just published a massive public post, and she had tagged every single member of our extended family. I clicked on the post, my eyes immediately falling to the photographs she had attached. A cold wave of revulsion washed over me. The pictures were 10 years old. They were taken during the darkest, most vulnerable month of my entire life, right after I had dropped out of law school and suffered a complete mental breakdown. In the first photo, I sat on the floor of my childhood bedroom, my hair unwashed and matted, wearing baggy sweatpants and a heavily stained shirt. My eyes were red and swollen from crying, and I looked painfully thin and utterly broken. The second photo was even worse. It was a close photograph of me asleep on the couch, surrounded by prescription pill bottles and crumpled tissues, looking heavily medicated and completely disconnected from the world. My mother had taken those photos. She had told me she was documenting my recovery progress for my therapist. Instead, she had kept them hidden away for a decade, waiting for the perfect moment to weaponize my trauma. Now Courtney had broadcasted my lowest moments to hundreds of people. I read the caption Courtney had crafted below the images. It was a masterpiece of manipulation. It read, "Please keep my family in your prayers. For years we have silently struggled to care for my older sister Diana. She has battled severe untreated mental illness and intense paranoia. We tried everything to help her, but she completely lost touch with reality. Tonight she experienced a terrifying psychotic break, fled from our family Thanksgiving dinner, and is now wandering the city alone. We are taking emergency legal action to protect her from herself and to save her from financial scammers trying to exploit her delusions. My heart is broken. I am trying to save my sister." The audacity of the lie was breathtaking. Courtney had painted herself as the heartbroken, devoted sibling while publicly branding me as a delusional, paranoid liability. The post was designed to instantly legitimize their fraudulent conservatorship petition in the eyes of our social circle. She was planting the seed of my insanity so deeply that when they dragged me into court on Monday, everyone we knew would already be convinced that I belonged in a locked psychiatric facility. I scrolled down to the comments section. The replies were pouring in a chorus of sympathy for Courtney and my parents mixed with feigned pity for me. The public post was only the beginning. My text message inbox was rapidly filling up with venomous messages from extended family members who had swallowed Courtney's narrative without a single question. My Aunt Patricia sent a long, blistering paragraph accusing me of being a spoiled, ungrateful monster for hurting my aging parents after everything they had sacrificed for me. My cousin Greg told me I needed to stop acting like a lunatic and check myself into a hospital immediately before I completely ruined the family name. The messages grew increasingly hateful with each passing minute. They called me selfish. They called me sick. They demanded that I apologize to my sister and submit to my father's authority. Sitting in the luxurious quiet of the penthouse reading the vile words sent by people who shared my blood, I did not cry. I did not feel the crushing, suffocating shame that my family was so desperately trying to inflict upon me. Instead, I felt an intense, liberating detachment. I was watching them dig their own graves in real time. Every hateful text message, Every public comment confirming their belief in my supposed mental incompetence was a gift. They were providing me with a mountain of written time-stamped evidence of organized harassment and defamation. I did not reply to a single message. I did not defend myself or beg them to believe me. I simply took screenshot after screenshot, methodically documenting every threat, every insult, and every lie. I uploaded the entire batch of images directly to a secure encrypted server housed at Apex Forensics. As I finished securing the last screenshot, a new notification popped up on the screen. It was a voicemail alert. I clicked the play button and lifted the phone to my ear. The voice that filled the speaker belonged to my Uncle Richard, my father's older brother. He was a retired judge, a man who carried immense weight in local legal circles, and whose opinion was treated as gospel by the rest of the family. He had always despised me, viewing my quiet independence as a personal insult to the family hierarchy. Diana listened to me very carefully. Uncle Richard began, his voice dripping with condescension and absolute authority. Your father just called me and explained the situation. You have caused our family enough embarrassment for one evening. This little childish rebellious phase ends right now. I have reviewed the emergency medical freeze Courtney secured, and I fully support their actions to take control of your finances. You are clearly unwell, and you have been for a very long time. If you decide to fight this conservatorship, if you dare to walk into that courtroom on Monday and make a scene, I will personally take the stand against you. I will testify under oath that I have witnessed your mental decline firsthand. I will tell the judge that you are entirely unfit to manage your own life, and I will claim that you have been hallucinating this ridiculous independent career of yours for years. Do not ever test me, Diana. Surrender your assets quietly right now, or we will legally destroy you. The message ended, leaving the penthouse in a ringing silence. I lowered the phone. Uncle Richard's booming voice still echoed against the glass walls. 10 years ago, my family threatening my freedom would have shattered my mind. Tonight, it simply provided the final piece of the puzzle. They were unified in their delusion, convinced their aggression would force me to submit. I dialed Daniel back. I need you in Chicago tomorrow morning, I told him. Bring the physical financial dossiers you compiled on Derek. I am already packing, Daniel replied. What is the target? Tomorrow night is the Platinum Horizon Charity Gala, I explained. Derek hosts it every year to court wealthy investors and maintain his facade of endless liquidity. My family forbade me from attending, claiming my presence would be a social liability. We are going to crash it. Friday evening arrived with a biting chill, but the atmosphere outside the ballroom was electric. Luxury vehicles idled at the valet stand, depositing Chicago's financial elite onto a red carpet. Flashbulbs popped in rapid succession, capturing the smiles of venture capitalists and real estate moguls. This was Derek's ultimate playground, an environment where he could project an image of untouchable wealth while secretly drowning in a multi-million-dollar deficit. I stepped out of the car, feeling the weight of Daniel's hand against my back. He looked immaculate in a midnight blue tuxedo, a solid anchor against the swirling energy. I wore a custom emerald green silk gown that cascaded to the floor in elegant lines. It featured a structured neckline and a dramatically low back, projecting absolute authority. It was not a dress meant for blending in. It was armor. We bypassed the main entry and walked toward the VIP doors. The air inside the venue was thick with expensive perfume and affluent networking. Waiters drifted through the crowd carrying silver trays of champagne. I scanned the room easily, picking out the faces of my extended family scattered among the wealthy guests. They were in their element, drinking Derek's liquor and basking in the glow of his fraudulent empire. I felt the shift in energy before I saw her. A ripple of hushed whispers spread through the crowd. I turned slowly, a crystal glass of sparkling water in my hand, and locked eyes with Courtney. She was standing next to one of Derek's primary investors mid-laugh. The moment she registered my face, her laughter died instantly. Her jaw dropped and the color drained from her cheeks, leaving her looking hollow. The shock lasted only a fraction of a second. It was immediately replaced by a surge of furious malice. She slammed her champagne glass onto a passing waiter's tray. She marched across the ballroom floor, pushing past evening gowns, completely ignoring the startled murmurs of the guests she shoved aside. My mother Linda spotted the commotion and rushed to follow her daughter, her face tight with rising panic. "What are you doing here?" Courtney hissed, stopping 2 feet in front of me. She looked me up and down, her eyes flashing with a mixture of rage and raw jealousy. "You are legally restricted from accessing your funds. How did you even get past the front door?" I simply smiled, taking a slow sip of my water. "I walked through it, Courtney. It is a charity gala, not a fortress." My mother arrived breathless and clutching her pearl necklace. "Diana, you need to leave right this instant," she demanded in a harsh whisper. "You are going to ruin Derek's most important night of the year." "I am not leaving," I replied, keeping my voice perfectly level. "I am here to enjoy the evening and perhaps make a few charitable donations. I hear Derek is desperate for capital." Courtney's eyes widened, a flash of genuine panic crossing her face before she forced it back beneath a sneer. "You do not belong here," she said. Her voice was quieter now, but no less poisonous. "Nobody in this room even knows who you are." Before I could answer, a distinguished older man separated himself from a nearby circle of investors and approached us. I recognized him immediately as Malcolm Avery, chairman of Horizon Capital, one of the largest institutional investment groups in the Midwest. His expression brightened when he saw me. "Diana Wilson," he said, warmly extending his hand. "I was told you might be attending tonight, but I did not believe it until I saw you myself." I accepted his handshake. "Malcolm, it has been a long time." "Far too long," he replied. "Your team saved our European division from a catastrophic acquisition fraud last year. My board still speaks about the recovery as if it were a military rescue operation." Several nearby guests turned toward us. Conversations quieted as people began recognizing Malcolm and listening to the exchange. Courtney stared between us, her confident expression beginning to fracture. Malcolm turned toward Daniel and greeted him by name before looking back at me. "I also wanted to thank you for increasing the foundation's contribution this evening," he continued. "The venue director told me Apex Forensics became one of the gala's principal sponsors at the last minute. That was extraordinarily generous." My mother's fingers tightened around her pearl necklace. "Principal sponsor," Linda repeated weakly. Malcolm looked at her, apparently noticing Courtney and Linda for the first time. "I am sorry," he said politely. "Are you relatives of Miss Wilson?" Courtney recovered enough to force a brittle laugh. "She is my younger sister," she answered. "Although I think there has been some confusion. Diana does not run a company. She has been unwell for years." The warmth vanished from Malcolm's expression. He looked at Courtney with the cold assessment of a man accustomed to detecting lies across a negotiation table. "There is no confusion, Mrs. Foster," he said. "I have personally retained Miss Wilson's company on 3 separate international investigations. She is one of the most respected forensic executives in the country." The surrounding silence deepened. Several investors who had been watching from a distance stepped closer, offering greetings of their own. One thanked me for identifying a fraudulent acquisition target. Another mentioned an audit Apex had completed for his banking group. Within seconds, the social hierarchy Courtney had spent years worshipping had reorganized itself around me. Linda stared at the people gathering nearby, her face pale with disbelief. "Why did you never tell us?" she whispered. I met her eyes calmly. "You never asked who I became," I said. "You only kept reminding me who I used to be." Courtney opened her mouth, but nothing came out. For the first time that evening, she had no audience willing to accept her version of me. I excused myself from Malcolm's group and turned my attention across the ballroom. My sister was no longer the person who mattered. I had come for the man whose desperation had set this entire conspiracy in motion. I spotted him near the grand staircase. Derek was holding court surrounded by a tight circle of older men in expensive tuxedos. These were his primary investors, the men whose capital he had squandered, and whose money he was desperately trying to replace with my stolen funds. He stood tall, A charismatic smile plastered across his face, gesturing broadly with a champagne flute. He looked oblivious to the scene that had just unfolded near the VIP entrance. Daniel placed a gentle hand on the small of my back, a silent signal that he was right there with me. We bypassed my frozen sister and mother, stepping smoothly through the parting crowd. People naturally stepped aside, their curiosity piqued by the sudden shift in power dynamic. As I drew closer to Derek's group, I could hear him bragging about his latest commercial development project. He was weaving a masterful tale of projected returns and market dominance, selling them a complete fantasy built on absolute lies. I stepped into the circle smoothly, inserting myself between two of his wealthiest backers. Derek paused mid-sentence, his charismatic smile faltering for a fraction of a second as he registered my presence. He clearly had not expected me to bypass security, let alone approach him while he was managing his most critical relationships. But Derek was a seasoned manipulator. He quickly masked his surprise with a look of patronizing concern, extending his free hand toward me, preparing to play the role of the worried brother-in-law. "Diana, what a surprise to see you here," Derek said, his voice dripping with fake sympathy. "We have been terribly worried about you since Thanksgiving dinner. Are you sure you should be out tonight? You have not been well." The investors exchanged uneasy glances, clearly remembering Courtney's social media post from earlier. I did not raise my voice. I did not make a scene. I took a slow, deliberate step forward, closing the distance between us, until I was standing well within his personal space. The scent of his expensive cologne mixed with the sudden odor of nervous sweat. I leaned in close, bringing my lips just inches from his ear, ensuring that the investors could not hear a single syllable of what I was about to say. I kept my voice soft, calm, and perfectly steady as I spoke to him. I recited the first 9-digit routing number. I paused for a single heartbeat, letting the sequence register in his brain. Then, I recited the second routing number. Finally, I delivered the third. They were the exact codes for 3 highly concealed offshore bank accounts located in the Cayman Islands, the precise accounts where he had been funneling his investors' capital to hide his catastrophic deficit. I pulled back slightly to observe the destruction of his composure. The transformation was instantaneous and terrifying. All the color vanished from Derek's face, leaving his skin a sickly ashen gray. A thick bead of sweat materialized at his temple, sliding rapidly down the side of his face. His pupils dilated in pure terror. He tried to swallow, but his throat bobbed uselessly. The tremor started in his shoulders and traveled violently down his right arm. His fingers wrapped around the delicate stem of his champagne flute began to shake so severely that the pale liquid sloshed over the rim, splashing onto his polished shoes. He lost his grip entirely. The crystal flute slipped through his trembling fingers and plummeted toward the marble floor. The glass shattered with a sharp crack that echoed loudly over the sophisticated hum of the gala. The investors jumped back, startled by the sudden noise and the spray of champagne and crystal shards. Derek stared down at the broken glass, his chest heaving, looking like a man who had just watched his own execution order being signed. I offered him a sweet, perfectly pleasant smile. "Enjoy the rest of your evening, Derek," I said, pitching my voice loud enough for the confused investors to hear. "It is always a pleasure catching up on family business." I turned away from him, slipping my hand gracefully through the crook of Daniel's arm. We began to walk toward the exit, our pace relaxed and unhurried. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw Courtney finally break out of her stunned paralysis. She had witnessed the exchange from across the room, seen the glass shatter, and recognized that I was walking away victorious. Her face contorted into a mask of absolute fury. She let out a sharp, enraged cry and lunged forward, intent on physically attacking me right there on the ballroom floor. She never made it. Derek, fueled by raw panic, lunged sideways and caught her hard by the upper arm. He yanked her back with brutal force, pulling her against his chest. She struggled against his grip, her heels slipping on the marble as she tried to break free to reach me. Derek clamped his other hand over her wrist, his knuckles white, physically restraining his wife from causing a spectacle that would draw even more attention to his crumbling empire. He looked terrified, practically dragging her backward as we smoothly exited through the double doors and stepped out into the crisp Chicago night. The adrenaline of the gala faded, replaced by a calculating focus, as Daniel and I spent the rest of the night reviewing the final financial dossiers. When the sun finally rose over the city skyline, I was sitting at my desk sipping black coffee and waiting. The stillness of the morning was broken by the chime of the private elevator doors opening. A courier stepped into the entryway carrying a thick manila envelope sealed with red wax. Daniel signed for the delivery and brought it to my desk. I pulled out the crisp, legally binding documents. It was the official court summons I expected. I was being ordered to appear before Judge Robert Harrison on Monday morning to determine my mental competency and finalize the permanent conservatorship over my life and my assets. My phone suddenly buzzed loudly on the wooden desk right beside the paperwork. I picked it up and unlocked the screen. It was a direct text message from Courtney sent just moments ago. She was still reeling from the humiliation at the gala and the physical altercation with her husband. She was blindly lashing out with the only pathetic weapon she believed she had left. Her message was brief, arrogant, and entirely disconnected from the reality of what was about to happen to her. I stared at the glowing screen, silently reading the specific threatening words she had just typed out. "You are going to be locked in a padded cell by tomorrow afternoon." I did not reply. I simply pressed the power button on the side of the device, watching the screen go black, and tossed the phone onto my desk. Daniel watched me closely, his expression tight with concern. I met his gaze and nodded toward the door. "We need to leave the penthouse," I said, grabbing my coat from the back of the chair. "My private servers are powerful, but we need the full analytical capabilities of the main laboratory. We are going to headquarters." The drive to Apex Forensics was quick in the quiet Saturday morning traffic. My company occupied the top 3 floors of a heavily fortified glass and steel building in the financial district. We bypassed the weekend security detail with my biometric clearance and stepped into the main operations floor. The room was vast and deliberately dark, illuminated by rows of massive monitors and glowing server racks that hummed with quiet, relentless power. This was the fortress I had built from the ground up, a place where secrets went to die. We walked straight into the primary glass-walled conference room. Daniel immediately plugged his encrypted laptop into the main terminal, casting the financial data we had pulled from the gala onto the massive wall screens. The digital map of Derek's ruin spread out before us in a chaotic web of red lines and offshore bank routing numbers. For the next 3 hours, we sat in absolute silence, sifting through the transaction ledgers, cross-referencing shell companies, and tracing the flow of hidden capital. Daniel's fingers flew across his keyboard, bypassing firewalls and digging into the deepest, darkest corners of Derek's corporate portfolio. "I see the pattern," Daniel said, his voice dropping into a low, clinical register. He tapped a key, and a new spreadsheet appeared on the main screen, highlighting a series of massive wire transfers. "Look at the dates, Diana." He did not just lose investor capital in a bad real estate market, he actively moved it. Derek has been siphoning money from his primary institutional investors and funneling it into these 3 offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands to cover his own personal debts and lavish lifestyle. I leaned forward, my eyes scanning the staggering numbers. It was textbook embezzlement. Derek had stolen from the wealthiest, most ruthless people in Chicago, and he had done it with the sloppy arrogance of a man who believed he was invincible. "Pull the aggregate total," I instructed, my voice echoing slightly in the quiet room. "I want to know exactly how much money he stole from his own firm." Daniel ran the calculation algorithm. A single bold number appeared in the center of the screen. $3.8 million. The breath caught in my throat. The number stared back at me, familiar and sickening. I slowly sat back in my leather chair as the horrific truth finally clicked into place. It was not a random grab for cash. It was a precise, calculated extraction. $3.8 million. I repeated, the cold reality settling over me like a heavy blanket. That is the exact balance of my localized liquidity pool. That is the segregated corporate reserve Courtney uncovered after illegally accessing my private financial records. Daniel stopped typing, his hands hovering over the keyboard as he turned to look at me. The realization hit him just as hard. Courtney did not just stumble upon a random savings account, he said, his voice tight with disgust. She went digging for it. Derek told her exactly how much money he needed to avoid federal prison, and she hunted for a way to provide it. When she saw that your account held the exact sum required to plug the massive hole in his firm, she decided to sacrifice you to save him. They could not just ask me for the money, I said, the pieces of their sinister motive falling into perfect alignment. If they asked for a loan, I would have demanded to see their corporate ledgers. I would have found the embezzlement immediately. They needed to seize the money without my consent, and they needed to do it instantly. That is why they orchestrated the conservatorship. They fabricated a psychotic break so they could legally steal the exact amount needed to cover up a federal crime. The sheer malice of their plan was breathtaking. My own sister had diagnosed me with severe mental illness, weaponized my past trauma, and dragged my reputation through the mud, all to execute a desperate financial heist. But as I stared at the numbers on the screen, a new question emerged, gnawing at the edge of my mind. Daniel? I said, narrowing my eyes at the screen. How did they finance this legal ambush? You told me Judge Harrison takes massive kickbacks. Fast-tracking an emergency medical freeze on a holiday weekend requires incredibly expensive legal retainers and heavy bribes. If Derek is secretly broke and desperate for my $3.8 million, how did they pay the attorneys to file the injunction yesterday? Daniel frowned, his eyes darting back to his screen. That is an excellent question. Let me run a deep dive asset check on your parents. They are the primary petitioners on the conservatorship filing, which means their financial footprint is tied to the legal fees. The room fell silent again, save for the rapid clicking of keys. I watched the progress bar on the screen inch forward, my stomach twisting with a heavy, sinking dread. I knew my parents worshipped Derek. I knew they despised my independence. But I was about to find out exactly how far they were willing to go to destroy me. Got it, Daniel said, but his voice lacked its usual triumph. He sounded genuinely sickened. Diana, you need to look at this. He pulled up a newly filed property record from the county clerk's database. I stared at the document, reading the names and the staggering financial figures. My parents, Thomas and Linda, owned their sprawling suburban home outright. They had paid off the mortgage years ago. But according to the document on the screen just 4 days ago, they had taken out a massive secondary mortgage on the property. They leveraged their own home, Daniel explained, pointing to the transaction history below the property record. The bank wired them the funds on Wednesday morning. By Wednesday afternoon, those exact funds were dispersed into 2 separate accounts. Half went to the high-powered legal firm representing your sister, and the other half was routed to a discreet holding company owned by Judge Harrison's brother-in-law. I sat in the glow of the monitors, feeling a profound, hollow chill seep into my bones. My parents were not just naive victims manipulated by Courtney and Derek. They were fully, actively complicit. They had willingly mortgaged their own home, risking their entire financial security to pay the bribes and legal fees necessary to legally kidnap me. They had committed bank fraud and bribery to help their golden son-in-law cover up his own massive embezzlement scheme. They had sold me out to save him. Daniel reached across the table and placed his hand gently over mine. His grip was warm and grounding against the cold reality of my family's betrayal. I am so sorry, Diana, he said softly. Do not be, I replied, my voice devoid of emotion. They made their choice. Now we make ours. Why the sudden rush? Why execute the ambush on Thanksgiving? They moved with a level of frantic desperation that means they are running out of time. Find out what their deadline is. Daniel turned back to his laptop, his expression hardening into pure tactical focus. He accessed a secure federal regulatory database cross-referencing Derek's corporate filings with upcoming institutional oversight schedules. He pulled up a calendar and zoomed in on the upcoming week. Here's the catalyst, Daniel said, highlighting a specific entry on Tuesday. Derek's firm is scheduled for a mandatory quarterly audit by his largest institutional investor. It is an intensive deep dive review of his capital reserves. Daniel turned to face me, his eyes burning with intense urgency. Diana, if Derek does not replace that $3.8 million by Tuesday morning, the auditors will immediately flag the deficit. They will notify the Securities and Exchange Commission, and federal investigators will raid his firm before noon. He will be indicted for corporate fraud and embezzlement. The conservatorship hearing on Monday is not just a power play. It is their absolute last chance. It is their desperate lifeline. If they do not lock you in a facility and seize your assets by Monday afternoon, Derek is going to federal prison. Sunday morning brought an overcast sky to Chicago. I was sipping coffee when my phone vibrated with a text from my father. After days of proxy attacks through Courtney, Thomas decided to step into the arena himself. His message was brief and sickeningly polite. He asked me to meet him and my mother at a bustling artisan coffee shop. He called it a chance to clear the air and find a peaceful resolution before things escalated in court on Monday. I stared at the message, a cold smile touching my lips. They were not looking for peace. They were running out of time. I dressed carefully for the meeting, choosing a tailored charcoal trench coat that projected quiet control, a stark contrast to the chaotic desperation I was about to encounter. I drove to the coffee shop and parked a block away. I held all the cards and I was ready. The coffee shop was packed. The air was thick with the scent of espresso and warm pastries. The hiss of the milk steamer and overlapping conversations created a lively atmosphere. It was exactly the kind of highly public venue my parents preferred for confrontations. They relied on an audience to keep me compliant, assuming my fear of making a scene would force my surrender. I spotted them sitting in a plush corner booth near the windows. Thomas sat rigidly upright, wearing a tense expression. Linda sat beside him, nervously twisting the strap of her handbag. I walked over and slid into the chair opposite them. Neither of them offered a greeting. The air between us was instantly heavy with unspoken hostility. "Thank you for coming, Diana." Thomas began leaning forward and resting his forearms on the wooden table. He kept his voice low, but the underlying edge of command was unmistakable. "We want to put an end to this ugliness," Thomas continued. "Your mother and I spent the weekend agonizing, and we found a way to resolve it without dragging our family name through the mud tomorrow. The conservatorship was a drastic measure, but we acted out of extreme concern for your well-being. Courtney was terrified when you ran out and she simply wanted to protect you. However, the last thing any of us wants is a protracted court battle. We are willing to call off the attorneys and withdraw the petition for the emergency freeze. And in exchange, I prompted, my voice perfectly flat. Thomas shifted slightly in his seat. In exchange, you will voluntarily transfer the $3.8 million from your account directly into Derek's holding trust today. It is a simple family loan, Diana. Derek has a temporary cash flow issue. If you transfer the funds today, we drop the conservatorship. Furthermore, your mother and I will officially welcome you back into the family." I stared at the man who had raised me, marveling at the depth of his delusion. He was offering to sell me back my freedom and dangling the toxic prize of conditional love as a bargaining chip. They genuinely believed I was weak enough to pay my own ransom. Before I could respond, Linda decided to play her part. She had been waiting for her cue, executing it with terrifying precision. She let out a loud, shuddering sob that instantly cut through the ambient noise of the coffee shop. People at adjacent tables turned their heads, their conversations halting as they looked over at our booth. Two baristas paused what they were doing, drawn to the crying woman in the corner. Linda ignored them, keeping her tear-filled eyes fixed on me. She reached across the table, hands shaking dramatically as she tried to grasp mine. I smoothly pulled my hands back, letting her grasp empty air. She let out another theatrical sob, ensuring her voice carried to the surrounding patrons. "Diana, please," Linda cried out, her voice trembling with manufactured heartbreak. "Please just do the right thing. We are begging you. You are so sick, sweetheart. You have been sick for a long time, and it breaks my heart to see you living in this paranoia. We just want to get you the psychiatric help you desperately need. We love you, but you are destroying this family with your delusions. Just transfer the money to your brother-in-law so we can focus on getting you into a treatment facility. We cannot bear to watch you suffer from this illness any longer." The people sitting closest to us were openly staring. A young woman looked at me with alarm and profound pity. An older gentleman frowned, shaking his head in sympathy for my poor mother. Linda was putting on the performance of a lifetime. She painted me as a mentally unstable burden, elevating herself to the role of a desperate, loving martyr. They expected me to shrink to succumb to the social pressure of the crowded room and quietly agree to their extortion just to make the spectacle stop. I did not break eye contact with my mother. I watched the fake tears rolling down her cheeks, feeling nothing but clinical fascination. I reached down into my tailored bag sitting on the floor beside my chair. My movements were slow, deliberate, and completely devoid of the panic they were trying to induce. I pulled out a thick manila folder and placed it squarely in the center of the wooden table. I did not say a word. I simply placed my hand on top of the folder and slid it smoothly across the table until it rested directly in front of him. I withdrew my hand and waited. Thomas stared at me before flipping open the cover. I watched his face as his eyes adjusted to the documents inside. The transformation was instantaneous. The arrogant patriarch vanished. His skin turned a chalky, bloodless white. His jaw went slack and his eyes widened in absolute horror. Inside the folder was the undeniable proof of their impending ruin. It held the records of the massive secondary mortgage they had taken out on their home 4 days ago to pay the corrupt judge and aggressive attorneys. More importantly, it contained the formal foreclosure notices generated by the bank. I had instructed Daniel to pull the trigger on their debt the moment we confirmed Derek's embezzlement. Because Derek was never going to be able to pay them back, they were going to default on that loan immediately. The documents proved that the bank was already moving to seize their home, leaving them destitute and heavily implicated in a federal financial crime. Linda stopped her performative crying. She wiped her eyes and looked down at the open folder. She let out a sharp gasp, her hands flying to her mouth as the reality of their financial devastation registered. I stood up slowly, smoothing my coat. I looked down at the two people who had spent their lives trying to break me. I offered them a cold smile that did not reach my eyes. I turned and walked toward the exit, leaving them sitting in the ashes of their own greed. The crisp Chicago air felt refreshing as I stepped outside onto the sidewalk. My phone buzzed inside my coat pocket. I pulled it out and found another message from Courtney. "Enjoy your little performance," she had written. "By tomorrow morning, every door you think you own will be closed to you." The wording was different from her earlier threats, but the desperation behind it was unmistakable. She was no longer speaking like someone certain of victory. She was speaking like someone watching her final escape route disappear. I deleted the message and slipped the phone into my pocket. I drove back to my hotel penthouse where Daniel had relocated our command center. When I stepped inside, Daniel was pacing the hardwood floor. I told him exactly about the coffee shop and Courtney's latest threat. We knew what that text meant. Thomas and Linda had rushed to call Derek and Courtney, delivering the news that their leverage was gone, their house was lost, and the federal audit was going to ruin them all by Tuesday morning. Courtney was backed into a corner. Her malicious scheme had collapsed, leaving her husband facing federal prison and her parents facing homelessness. In her mind, I was the only obstacle. More specifically, the corporate black card she knew I carried tied directly to Apex Forensics' primary operating accounts. She genuinely believed that if she could get her hands on that plastic, she could force a wire transfer large enough to plug the hole in Derek's firm. It was a delusion born of pure panic. At 3 o'clock, the security monitor on Daniel's desk lit up with a pulsing red alert. We moved to the screen. The camera feed from the private elevator lobby showed Courtney. She looked entirely disheveled, her designer coat thrown over her shoulders haphazardly. She had bypassed the main lobby desk by tailgating a room service cart through the service corridors. When the polished metal doors slid open, Courtney stepped into my private foyer. She marched directly to my heavy oak double doors and grabbed the brass handle, rattling it violently. Finding it locked, she began to pound her fists against the solid wood. She kicked the door with her leather boot. Daniel reached for his phone, but the hotel's security team was already responding. The camera feed showed two large men in dark suits stepping out of the adjacent service elevator. "Ma'am, you need to step away from the door," the taller guard said, placing a firm hand on Courtney's shoulder. "You are trespassing." Courtney spun around. "Do not touch me!" she shrieked, swatting his hand away. "My sister is in there. She stole my husband's money. I need her black card. Tell her to open the door right now." The second guard stepped forward. "Ma'am, please lower your voice and come with us to the lobby. We can sort this out downstairs." Courtney refused to comply. She lunged toward the door again, desperately grabbing the brass handle. When the first guard stepped in her path to block her, she completely lost control. She shoved the guard hard in the chest, her fingernails scraping against his neck. The guard stumbled backward. His partner immediately closed the distance, grabbing Courtney by both arms and pinning them securely against her sides. "Let go of me!" she screamed, thrashing wildly. She kicked her legs, completely abandoning any pretense of sanity. "Help me! Somebody help me!" As she struggled, she managed to wrench her right arm free just enough to reach into her coat pocket. She pulled out her cell phone, frantically dialing a number. Daniel and I watched as she raised the phone, tears streaming down her face, her voice taking on a pitch of absolute terror. "Yes, I need police immediately," Courtney cried into the phone. "I am at the Grand Plaza Hotel penthouse. My sister Diana, she kidnapped me. She dragged me up here and tried to lock me in. She is having a severe violent psychotic episode. She attacked me and now her security guards are holding me hostage. Please hurry, she is completely out of her mind and I am terrified for my life." Daniel raised an eyebrow, looking from the screen to me. "She is actually trying to frame you for kidnapping. She is trying to build a police record of a psychotic break to present to the judge tomorrow," I corrected. "She thinks if she can get me arrested for a violent outburst today, the conservatorship will be granted automatically on Monday morning." Within 10 minutes, the camera feed showed 4 uniformed police officers stepping out of the elevator. They found Courtney sitting on the floor of the foyer, sobbing loudly into her hands, while the 2 hotel security guards stood several feet away, maintaining a professional distance. The moment Courtney saw the police, she scrambled to her feet. "Thank God you are here," she wept, pointing a trembling finger at my closed door. "She is in there." She dragged me upstairs and completely lost her mind. She tried to lock me inside, and when I managed to escape into the hallway, these men attacked me. "You have to break that door down. She is a danger to herself and everyone else. You need to take her to a psychiatric ward right now." The lead officer looked at the calm guards. She reached up and pointed to the discreet black dome mounted in the corner of the ceiling. "You do realize there is a high-definition security camera pointed directly at this hallway?" "Correct," the officer asked, her tone shifting from cautious to deeply skeptical. Courtney froze. The manufactured tears stopped rolling down her cheeks. Her eyes darted up to the black dome, and the color rapidly drained from her face, as the reality of her colossal miscalculation set in. The officer radioed down to the lobby, requesting dispatch to coordinate with the hotel's central security office. Daniel and I watched the screen as minutes ticked by in heavy silence. Courtney stood rigid, staring at the floor. The guards remained impassive. Finally, the lead officer's radio crackled to life. The voice on the other end confirmed they had reviewed the footage. The report verified that Courtney had arrived alone, tailgated her way upstairs, violently pounded on the locked door, and initiated an unprovoked physical assault on the hotel staff. The officer slowly unclipped a citation pad from her belt. She looked at Courtney with an expression of absolute disgust. "Ma'am," the officer said, her voice echoing sharply, "we have just confirmed that you were never inside that penthouse. You were never kidnapped, and the only person exhibiting violent, erratic behavior in this hallway is you." Courtney opened her mouth to argue, but no words came out. She looked completely hollowed out, a woman who had just watched her final desperate gamble explode in her face. "You are being issued a formal citation for trespassing on private property," the officer continued, writing rapidly on the pad. "Furthermore, you are being cited for filing a false police report and misuse of the 911 emergency system. I suggest you contact an attorney because the hotel staff has also indicated they wish to press simple assault charges against you. The officers flanked her on either side, physically escorting her into the elevator and down to the street level, removing her from the premises. As the elevator doors closed on the feed, Daniel turned to his laptop. His fingers flew across the keyboard, accessing the secure portal he shared with our legal team. I am having our attorneys pull the official police report and the hotel security footage right now, he said, a grim smile forming on his face. This is the final nail in the coffin for her. We are going to walk into that courtroom tomorrow morning and hand the judge undeniable documented proof that the primary witness demanding your psychiatric confinement was just cited by the police for a violent, hysterical meltdown. I nodded slowly, letting the gravity of Daniel's words settle over the room. The sheer poetic justice of Courtney handing us the weapon we needed to destroy her credibility was almost too perfect. She had tried to manufacture a psychotic episode to strip me of my rights, and instead, she permanently documented her own unhinged desperation. We did not waste another minute celebrating. The clock was ticking relentlessly toward Monday morning, and there was a tremendous amount of groundwork left to lay before the sun rose. Daniel and I packed up our equipment and left the hotel, driving straight back to the fortified sanctuary of Apex Forensics. By 8 o'clock Sunday evening, my executive boardroom had been transformed into a war room. The expansive mahogany table was completely covered in thick financial dossiers, legal briefs, and blown-up photographs of Derek's offshore wire transfers. The city lights of Chicago twinkled harmlessly through the floor-to-ceiling glass windows, a stark contrast to the heavy, serious atmosphere inside the room. I sat at the head of the table, flanked by Daniel and my lead corporate attorney, Marcus Vance. Marcus was a seasoned litigator who possessed a reputation for merciless precision in the courtroom. Sitting opposite us were three individuals who did not work for my company. Two were special agents with the FBI's white-collar crime division, and the third was an auditor from the Securities and Exchange Commission. I had reached out to my contacts at the SEC late Friday night, providing them with just enough raw data to trigger their immediate interest. When they saw the magnitude of Derek's missing institutional funds and the glaring irregularities in his liquidity pool, they had contacted the FBI. Now they were sitting in my boardroom, ready to execute a coordinated takedown. Special Agent Miller, a tall, imposing man with graying hair and a sharp gaze, leaned forward and adjusted his glasses. He looked over the freshly printed police citation we had just received from the hotel incident. Your sister certainly has a flair for the dramatic. Miss Wilson, Miller said, his tone dry. This citation for filing a false police report is going to be incredibly useful to your attorney tomorrow morning. It shatters her claim that you are a danger to yourself or others. Marcus nodded, tapping his gold pen against his legal pad. Judge Harrison might be corrupt, Marcus explained, looking around the table, but he is not stupid. He accepted their bribe to fast-track the hearing, but he still has to maintain the appearance of judicial procedure. He cannot legally grant a permanent conservatorship when the primary witness is facing pending criminal charges for perjury and simple assault. The moment I submit this police report into evidence, their medical emergency narrative collapses completely. I folded my hands on the table, feeling a deep, quiet sense of control. Courtney's credibility was gone. My parents' financial leverage was currently being foreclosed upon. The only piece left on the board was Derek. I looked directly at Agent Miller. What is the exact status of the task force? I asked, my voice steady. Are we fully aligned on the schedule? Miller nodded, sliding a tactical timeline across the polished mahogany. We are locked in, he confirmed. My team has been quietly monitoring his corporate accounts since you flagged the initial offshore transfers. Derek is currently trying to liquidate two of his remaining legitimate assets to cover the $3.8 million deficit before the auditors arrive on Tuesday. We have quietly placed a federal freeze on those specific assets. He cannot move a single dime. He is completely paralyzed. I felt a cold smile touch my lips. Derek was trapped. He was staring down the barrel of a federal audit with absolutely no way to replace the stolen capital. His entire survival depended on Courtney successfully stealing my money in court tomorrow morning. Agent Miller tapped the timeline with a finger. "The conservatorship hearing begins at 9 o'clock tomorrow morning," he said, tracing a line down the page. "Our tactical teams will be positioned outside Derek's headquarters by 9:30. We are waiting for the exact moment your attorney dismantles their case." Once Judge Harrison denies the conservatorship and dismisses the petition, Derek will realize his final lifeline has been severed. We want him in a state of complete panic when we breach the doors. Marcus leaned back in his chair, a predatory gleam in his eyes. "The hearing will not take long," he assured the federal agents. "I will let their attorney present their fabricated medical claims, and then I will drop the police report and the offshore bank records right in the center of the courtroom. The judge will have no choice but to throw the case out immediately. I estimate the gavel will come down by 10 o'clock. Perfect, Miller said, making a final notation on his clipboard. At precisely 10 o'clock, the FBI will execute a raid on his firm. We will seize his servers, confiscate his hard drives, and take Derek into federal custody for embezzlement and wire fraud. He is looking at 20 years in a federal penitentiary. The room fell into a heavy, satisfied silence. Every trap was set. Every contingency had been accounted for. My family had spent the entire weekend trying to manipulate, extort, and frame me. Now the full weight of the federal government was about to drop on their heads. The federal agents packed up their briefcases, shaking my hand before Daniel escorted them to the private elevator. Marcus stayed behind for a few minutes, reviewing his opening statements for the morning before bidding me goodnight. By midnight, the boardroom was empty, save for Daniel and me. I stood up and walked over to the glass windows looking out over the sleeping city. The exhaustion of the past 3 days was finally beginning to catch up with me, but beneath the fatigue was a profound, unshakable sense of peace. For 10 years, I had allowed my family's shadow to dictate my choices. I had let their conditional love make me feel small. That ended tomorrow. Tomorrow, I would finally sever the invisible strings they had used to control me. Daniel walked over and stood beside me, his presence a quiet, steady anchor in the dark room. "We are ready," he said softly, looking out at the city lights. "Everything is in place. You hold all the cards, Diana." "I know," I whispered, resting my forehead against the cool glass. "I just want this nightmare to be over." Daniel reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. The screen illuminated his face with a pale blue glow. He frowned, his brow furrowing as he read something on the screen. He let out a short, humorless laugh and handed the phone to me. "I think you should see this," he said, his voice dripping with irony. "She really lives in her own reality." I took the phone and looked at the glowing screen. It was Courtney's social media profile. She had just posted a new photograph. It was a selfie taken on the sidewalk right outside the municipal courthouse. She was wearing designer sunglasses and a pathetic, sad smile, posing against the grand stone pillars. I read the caption she had typed out beneath the photo. "Tomorrow justice will be served and my poor sick sister will finally get the institutional help she needs. Hashtag Family First." The heavy oak doors of courtroom 3B swung open right at 9 o'clock on Monday morning. I walked down the center aisle with Marcus Vance on my right and Daniel on my left. The air inside the room was stale and heavy with the scent of floor wax and old paper. The wooden benches creaked as we took our seats at the respondents' table. Across the aisle, sitting at the petitioner's table, was my family. They had dressed for a funeral. Courtney wore a high-necked black dress, her hair pulled back into a severe bun, devoid of her usual heavy makeup. Thomas and Derek wore somber dark suits, while my mother clutched a crumpled tissue in her hands. Derek looked terrible. His skin was pale, and he kept obsessively checking his gold wristwatch. The federal auditors were due at his office tomorrow morning. In his mind, this courtroom was his only escape route. Judge Robert Harrison entered from his chambers, his black robe billowing slightly as he took his seat at the elevated bench. He was a man with a ruddy complexion and a perpetually bored expression. He banged his gavel once, the sharp crack echoing through the high-ceilinged room. He announced the case file, an emergency petition for temporary and permanent conservatorship over my person and my estate. He peered down at me over his reading glasses, his bias already evident. He had been paid handsomely to push this through, and he was eager to get it over with. Courtney's attorney, a slick, fast-talking man named Richard Sterling, stood up immediately. He addressed the judge with practiced gravity, painting a tragic picture of a family desperately trying to save a loved one from a severe psychological breakdown. He called his first witness to the stand. Courtney stood up, keeping her head bowed, and walked slowly to the witness box. She placed her hand on the Bible and swore to tell the truth. It was a spectacular piece of theater. As soon as she sat down, Courtney looked over at me with eyes full of manufactured sorrow. Sterling began his questioning, guiding her through a carefully constructed narrative of my supposed descent into madness. Courtney's voice trembled perfectly on cue. She told the judge that my mental health had been deteriorating for years, but that it had culminated in a terrifying episode during our Thanksgiving dinner. She claimed I had become violent, paranoid, and completely detached from reality. She started shouting about massive corporate empires, Courtney testified, her voice breaking as she brought a hand to her chest. She claimed she owned buildings and forensic laboratories. She was hallucinating vast wealth, talking about millions of dollars that simply do not exist. I tried to calm her down. Your Honor, but she was so unhinged. She looked right through me like I was an enemy. I was terrified she was going to hurt herself or someone in our family. Judge Harrison nodded sympathetically, leaning forward. And what happened after Thanksgiving, Mrs. Foster? He asked gently. Courtney let a single tear roll down her cheek. She vanished. She sobbed, wiping her face. She has been wandering the city, staying in random hotels, living in this paranoid delusion where she thinks everyone is trying to harm her. She even showed up at my husband's charity gala this weekend, acting erratically and threatening his investors. We are just so scared for her. She needs immediate institutionalization for her own safety. If she does not get intensive psychiatric help right now, we are going to lose her forever. I sat perfectly still, my face a mask of stone. Marcus Vance sat beside me, calmly taking notes on his yellow legal pad. He did not object. He did not interrupt. We let Courtney dig her grave as deep as she possibly could. She spent 20 minutes outlining my fictitious insanity, weaving a web of lies so dense and so manipulative that under any other circumstances a judge would have no choice but to grant the medical freeze. When she finally stepped down from the stand, she gave her lawyer a subtle, triumphant nod. Sterling called my father to the stand next. Thomas walked up with the heavy-burdened posture of a patriarch, watching his family fall apart. He took the oath and sat down, projecting absolute, unwavering authority. He corroborated every single word Courtney had spoken. He looked Judge Harrison dead in the eye and committed perjury without a single flinch or hesitation. My daughter has always been fragile, Thomas testified, his deep voice filling the courtroom. We tried to give her the independence she craved, but her mind simply could not handle the stress of the real world. She has fabricated an entire alternate reality to cope with her failures. It is devastating for a father to admit that his child has lost her mind, but we can no longer protect her from herself. She is a danger to her own well-being. My mother followed him. Linda did not even wait for the questions to begin before she started crying. She clutched the railing of the witness box, sobbing loudly for the court stenographer and the judge. She wailed about how much she missed her sweet, normal daughter. She claimed I had stopped sleeping, stopped eating, and had become completely consumed by paranoid delusions of grandeur. She begged the judge to grant the conservatorship so they could force me into a secure medical facility where I could be heavily medicated and monitored around the clock. It was a masterclass in emotional manipulation. They were willing to lock me in a psychiatric ward, strip away my fundamental human rights, and drug me into compliance, all to cover their tracks. They had mortgaged their home to pay the man sitting on the bench, and they were putting on the exact show he needed to justify his corrupt ruling. I glanced up at the large clock mounted on the oak-paneled wall above the judge. It was 9:45. 15 minutes until the federal agents waiting outside Derek's firm would breach the doors. Daniel sat on my left, his eyes fixed on the clock as well. He gave me a barely perceptible nod. The timing was aligning perfectly. Sterling stood up to deliver his concluding argument for the emergency injunction. He walked to the center of the floor, addressing Judge Harrison with a look of grave urgency. He summarized the tearful testimonies, emphasizing the immediate danger my supposed delusions posed to my physical safety. He painted my family as loving, desperate heroes trying to pull me back from the brink of total psychological collapse. Your Honor, the evidence presented today by a family unified in their grief and concern is overwhelming. Sterling stated, his voice ringing with self-righteous authority. Diana Wilson is experiencing a severe, undocumented break from reality. She is actively hallucinating wealth and corporate power, making her highly susceptible to exploitation by outside parties. We cannot wait for a standard medical evaluation. We need to act today to secure her safety and her assets. Sterling turned and pointed a finger directly at me, his eyes narrowing. During her delusions, the respondent has managed to hoard a significant amount of liquid capital in a single, unmonitored bank account. She believes this money is part of her fictitious empire, but in reality, leaving such funds in the hands of an unstable individual is catastrophic. We have the routing information for this specific account. Derek sat up straighter at the petitioner's table, his eyes locking onto the back of his lawyer. This was the moment. This was the exact extraction they had planned all weekend. Therefore, Sterling concluded, slapping his hands down on the wooden podium, we are asking this court to grant the emergency conservatorship immediately. Furthermore, we boldly request that Your Honor issue an immediate order to seize the $3.8 million in that specific account. These funds must be transferred into a family-controlled trust today to pay for Diana's mandatory, indefinite psychiatric care. Sterling steps back from the podium, straightening his suit jacket with a smug look of absolute triumph. Derek leans forward in his chair, his eyes fixed hungrily on the judge, practically vibrating with anticipation. He can already taste the $3.8 million. He thinks he has won. He thinks his federal problem is about to vanish. Beside me, Marcus Vance does not object. He does not even stand up. He simply closes his gold pen with a soft click and places it carefully on top of his yellow legal pad. The silence in the courtroom stretches out heavy and suffocating. The air conditioning hums faintly in the background. My mother is dabbing her eyes with her tissue, putting on the final touches of her performance for the court stenographer. My father has his arms crossed over his chest, projecting the solemn dignity of a patriarch making a difficult but necessary choice. I keep my posture perfectly straight, my hands resting lightly in my lap, watching the man sitting elevated above us all. Judge Robert Harrison sits motionless for a long moment. He looks down at the thick stack of emergency medical affidavits and psychiatric petitions that Richard Sterling just submitted. These are the documents bought and paid for with a corrupt bribe funded by a secondary mortgage that is currently in default. The plan was simple. Sterling would make the impassioned plea, Harrison would accept the fabricated medical emergency, and the gavel would fall, locking me away and handing Derek the keys to my bank accounts. But something has changed. I can see it in the way Harrison's jaw tightens. He reaches out with a heavy hand, but he does not pick up Sterling's paperwork. Instead, he pushes the entire stack aside. The movement is slow and deliberate, scraping the heavy parchment across the polished mahogany bench. Sterling notices the gesture. His confident smile falters slightly. He takes a half step back toward the podium, clearly confused by the deviation from their arranged script. Judge Harrison holds up a single hand, his palm facing outward, stopping Sterling in his tracks before the lawyer can utter another word. That will be quite enough, Mr. Sterling, the judge says. His voice is remarkably quiet, yet it carries a sharp, resonant edge that instantly kills the ambient noise in the room. He reaches up and slowly removes his reading glasses, folding the earpieces inward with a sharp snap. He places the glasses on the bench and leans forward, lacing his fingers together. He does not look at Marcus. He does not look at me. His gaze bypasses the defense table entirely and locks directly onto the petitioner's table. He stares at Courtney, then at Linda, and finally at Thomas. The boredom that defined his expression at the beginning of the hearing has completely evaporated. It has been replaced by a cold, calculating gravity. Mr. Sterling has presented a very compelling narrative this morning. Judge Harrison begins, his voice echoing in the cavernous space. He has painted a picture of a woman entirely detached from reality. A woman who fabricates grandiose delusions to cope with her personal failures. According to the sworn testimony provided by this family, the respondent is utterly incapable of managing her own affairs, let alone possessing the vast sums of money she claims to control. The judge pauses, letting the words sink in. Courtney nods vigorously from her seat beside Derek. She genuinely believes the judge is summarizing her victory. She leans into her husband, shooting me a sideways glance filled with pure, unadulterated venom. She thinks the trap has successfully snapped shut on my ankle. But Judge Harrison is not finished. He shifts his gaze specifically to Courtney. Mrs. Foster, you sat in that witness box under penalty of perjury and testified that your sister is suffering from severe hallucinations. You stated that she invented a corporate empire out of thin air. You, along with your parents, claim she is mentally ill, incompetent, and utterly unfit to exist in society without mandatory psychiatric confinement. The judge leans a fraction of an inch closer, his eyes narrowing into dark slits. Let me ask you a very simple question. Do you actually know who she really is? The question hangs in the air, sudden and jarring. It is not a standard judicial inquiry. It is a direct challenge, and it catches Courtney completely off guard. She blinks, her brow furrowing in confusion. She looks at Sterling, hoping her lawyer will intervene, but Sterling remains frozen at the podium, sensing the dangerous shift in the room's atmosphere. When no objection comes, Courtney looks back up at the bench. She lets out a short, derisive scoff, rolling her eyes dramatically for the benefit of the court. She is my sister, Courtney says, her voice dripping with arrogant condescension. I have known her my entire life. She is a college dropout who hides from the real world. She has absolutely nothing to her name, and she needs to be heavily medicated before she hurts someone with her crazy lies. A quiet murmur ripples through the gallery behind us. My mother nods in agreement with Courtney's assessment, fresh tears welling in her eyes as she plays the part of the heartbroken parent. Thomas maintains his stoic frown, silently reinforcing the lie. Derek continues to check his watch, his impatience practically radiating across the aisle. They are all so thoroughly wrapped in their own manufactured reality that they cannot see the massive wave about to crash down over them. I do not react. I simply watch the judge, knowing exactly what is coming next. Judge Harrison does not blink. He slowly reaches down beneath the high lip of his mahogany bench. When his hand reappears, he is holding a thick, bound folder. It is not the cheap manila envelope my parents are used to seeing. This is a heavy, dark blue dossier stamped with a prominent, unmistakable gold foil crest. It is the official seal of the United States federal government. The judge lifts the dossier high enough for everyone at the petitioner's table to see it clearly. The heavy silence in the courtroom suddenly feels incredibly fragile, like the air right before a thunderstorm breaks. No, Mrs. Foster. Judge Harrison says, his voice ringing with absolute, undeniable authority. She is not a college dropout, she is not hallucinating, and she is certainly not incompetent. He lets the dossier drop onto his desk with a heavy thud that echoes like a gunshot. She is the chief executive officer of Apex Forensics. The words strike the petitioner's table like a physical blow. Courtney physically recoils in her chair, her mouth falling open in a silent gasp. The smug, arrogant mask vanishes from her face instantly, replaced by a look of sheer, uncomprehending shock. Beside her, Derek suddenly stops checking his watch. His head snaps up, his skin turning a sickening shade of gray. He knows that name. Everyone in the financial sector knows that name. Apex Forensics is not a small local accounting firm. It is a premier internationally recognized financial auditing agency. It is the exact firm that Daniel and I built from nothing, the firm that specialized in dismantling offshore embezzlement networks. My mother lets out a sharp, genuine gasp, dropping her crumpled tissue into her lap. Thomas sits rigidly upright, his hands gripping the edge of the wooden table so hard his knuckles turn white. They stare at me as if I have suddenly morphed into a stranger right before their eyes. The narrative they have spent years carefully constructing, the lie that I was a worthless failure, shatters into a million pieces on the courtroom floor. They cannot process the reality of what the judge has just declared. Judge Harrison ignores their stunned reactions. He opens the federal dossier, flipping past the first few pages with grim purpose. Your attorney requested an immediate seizure of $3.8 million. The judge continues, his tone laced with cold reprimand. He claimed those funds were part of a delusion. I have right here a certified federal banking ledger confirming that the account in question is very real. Furthermore, those funds are not personal savings. They are bonded operational capital belonging to Apex Forensics. Sterling actually takes a step backward, his face flushing crimson. He looks at Derek with wide, panicked eyes, silently asking why his client failed to mention that they were trying to steal bonded corporate funds from a major auditing firm. Derek cannot answer. He looks like a man who has just stepped off a cliff and is waiting to hit the ground. His breath comes in short, shallow gasps. But the judge is not finished. He has saved the final lethal piece of information for last. The bribe Derek paid him no longer matters. The federal agents waiting outside the building have forced his hand, and Judge Harrison is saving his own skin by delivering the execution order. He looks directly at Courtney, who is trembling in her seat, her perfectly manicured hands shaking uncontrollably. Judge Harrison leans forward, resting his forearms on the bench, and drops the ultimate bombshell. And she is the chief executive of the forensic firm appointed by federal regulators to audit the investment network now directly linked to your husband's company. The courtroom erupts in shocked whispers. The gallery behind us collectively gasps. The stifling silence that had gripped the room just seconds before shatters into a chaotic, buzzing hive of overlapping voices. At the petitioner's table, Derek looks as though all the blood has been violently drained from his body. He slumps backward into his heavy wooden chair, his mouth opening and closing soundlessly like a fish on dry land. He stares at me with an expression of pure, unadulterated terror. He finally understands why his offshore accounts had been frozen over the weekend. He finally realizes that he is not the clever predator setting a trap. He is the prey, and the steel cage has just snapped shut around him. Courtney is vibrating with a frantic panic. She looks wildly from her pale husband to her lawyer, her perfectly manicured hands gripping the edge of the polished table so tightly that her knuckles are bone white. Richard Sterling, the slick attorney who strutted around the courtroom moments ago with an air of absolute superiority, looks physically ill. A thick bead of sweat forms on his brow. He shuffles his legal papers aimlessly, frantically trying to calculate how much legal jeopardy he has just stepped into by presenting a fraudulent petition against a federally appointed auditor. In the spectator seating directly behind Courtney, Linda, and Thomas sit frozen in a state of absolute shock. My mother has dropped her theatrical act completely. Her hands tremble uncontrollably in her lap. There are no more fake tears, no more delicate dabs with her crumpled tissue. There is only a stark, horrifying realization that their financial leverage is entirely gone, their house is lost, and their favorite daughter is completely exposed as a fraud. Beside me, Marcus Vance finally moves. He stands up from his chair but does not rush. He moves with the slow, deliberate grace of a predator that has cornered its meal. He reaches down into his thick leather briefcase and pulls out a massive bound document. It is a 500-page financial report printed on crisp paper and secured with thick black binding. The sheer physical size of the dossier lands with a dull, heavy thud on our table before Marcus picks it up and walks calmly to the center aisle. "Your Honor," Marcus says, his deep voice cutting clearly through the remaining whispers in the gallery. At this time, we would like to submit into evidence the completed financial report and certified forensic audit of Derek Foster's commercial real estate firm, commissioned by the federal court and executed by Apex Forensics. Judge Harrison nods sharply, adjusting his black robes as he leans over the elevated bench to accept the heavy stack of documents. The judge is eager to distance himself from the bribery scheme, clearly intending to use my undeniable evidence to wash his hands clean of Derek's impending doom. He flips open the cover, scanning the executive summary that outlines millions of dollars in embezzled capital. We would also like to call our first and only witness to the stand. Marcus continues, turning to look directly at me. The defense calls Diana Wilson. I stand up from the respondent's table, smoothing the front of my tailored charcoal blazer. I walk down the short aisle toward the witness box with measured, confident steps. I do not look at my parents, and I do not look at Courtney. I keep my gaze fixed straight ahead, projecting the quiet, clinical authority that I utilize in every major corporate boardroom. I step up into the wooden box, place my right hand on the worn leather Bible, and swear to tell the whole truth. When I sit down and adjust the microphone, the contrast between my composed demeanor and Courtney's earlier hysterical performance is glaringly obvious. I am not a fragile, delusional woman suffering from a severe psychotic break. I am a highly trained professional executioner, and I am about to systematically, coldly dismantle their family's lies under oath. Miss Wilson. Marcus begins pacing slowly in front of the jury box. Could you please explain to the court the exact nature of your current professional assignment regarding Derek Foster's firm? I lean slightly into the microphone. For the past 4 months, Apex Forensics has been conducting a federally authorized investigation into a network of real estate investment vehicles suspected of hiding client losses through inflated valuations and offshore transfers, I stated. Until this weekend, the companies inside that network had been concealed behind layers of shell corporations and nominee ownership. When my team compared the routing information connected to the attempted seizure of our reserve account with the transactions already under federal review, we identified Derek Foster's company as the central operating entity behind the suspicious transfers. The evidence recovered since Friday has allowed us to connect his firm directly to the missing capital and determine how the money was concealed. During my investigation, I uncovered a highly sophisticated systemic embezzlement operation. Derek lets out a strangled, pathetic groan, sinking even further into his chair. Sterling puts a hand on his shoulder, trying to keep him quiet, but the sheer panic radiating from their table is palpable. Could you elaborate on the specifics of this operation? Marcus asks, prompting me to deliver the killing blow. I nod, keeping my eyes locked onto the judge. Derek Foster has been siphoning capital from his clients' escrow accounts and funneling the money through a series of shell companies registered in the Cayman Islands. He deliberately falsified property valuation reports to hide the missing funds. As of Friday afternoon, my team definitively traced a deficit of exactly $3.8 million. This stolen capital was used to fund an extravagant personal lifestyle that neither he nor his wife could afford without resorting to federal wire fraud. When Mr. Foster realized the audit was closing in on his offshore accounts, he panicked. He needed untraceable cash to replace the stolen escrow funds before the regulators arrived. Marcus pauses, letting the heavy silence hang in the air for a perfect theatrical second. And did you possess $3.8 million in personal liquid capital, Miss Wilson? No, I reply smoothly. However, as the CEO of Apex Forensics, I have signatory authority over our primary operational accounts. The account number that Mr. Sterling just submitted to this court, the specific account he demanded be seized and transferred to a family trust today, contains the bonded corporate payroll and operational funds for my entire company. The balance fluctuates, but on Friday, it held exactly $3.8 million. This entire conservatorship petition was a calculated, malicious conspiracy. My sister and my parents fabricated a medical emergency, willingly committed perjury, and attempted to strip me of my fundamental rights to steal that money to cover Derek's federal crimes. The courtroom erupts again. Courtney suddenly leaps to her feet, her chair scraping violently against the floor. She slams her hands down on the table, losing her mind on the stand as her face contorts into a mask of pure, unhinged fury. "She is lying!" Courtney screams, her voice cracking as it echoes off the high ceiling. She points a manic, trembling finger directly at me, completely ignoring the judge's authority. "Those documents are fake. She made them up because she is crazy. She belongs in a straitjacket. She is trying to ruin us. Give us the money. Derek needs that money right now. It is ours." "Order in this court." Judge Harrison roars, silencing her with a harsh, thunderous strike of his heavy wooden gavel. Richard Sterling scrambles to his feet, his face flushed with terror, raising his hands. Just as Courtney's lawyer attempts to object, the heavy wooden doors at the back of the courtroom burst open, and two federal agents step inside. The men wear dark suits with gold shields clipped to their belts. They do not pause to ask for permission. Their heavy footsteps thud rhythmically against the polished floorboards, bypassing the stunned spectators. The entire room holds its breath. Richard Sterling freezes at the podium, his mouth still half open from his aborted objection. He lowers his hand and takes 3 deliberate steps away from his clients. He is a very slick lawyer, but he recognizes the immense weight of the federal government when it walks into a room, and he wants no part of the blast radius. Derek Foster watches the agents approach with the wide, unblinking stare of a man facing a firing squad. He presses his back against his chair as if he can merge with the furniture and disappear. His breathing is shallow and rapid. One of the agents, a tall man with a stern face, stops directly behind the petitioner's table. His eyes are locked entirely on my brother-in-law. "Derek Foster," the agent says, his voice devoid of emotion. "You are under arrest for federal wire fraud, embezzlement, and conspiracy to commit financial crimes. Stand up and place your hands behind your back." Derek does not move. He seems physically incapable of processing the command. His hands remain paralyzed on the table, trembling so violently that a plastic water cup tips over, spilling a puddle across his fabricated documents. The second agent steps around the table, grips Derek by the elbow, and hauls him upward with effortless strength. The sharp metallic click of handcuffs ratcheting closed around Derek's wrists echoes through the silent courtroom like a pair of gunshots. Courtney finally snaps out of her shocked paralysis. She lunges out of her chair, her manicured fingers clawing at the fabric of the agent's suit jacket. "You cannot do this," she shrieks, her voice breaking into a hysterical pitch. "He is a respected businessman. You have no right to touch him. Let him go right now." The tall agent does not even blink. He casually swats her hands away with a firm motion. "Ma'am, step back." He commands, his tone projecting an absolute authority that instantly cowers her. "If you interfere with a federal arrest, you will be leaving in handcuffs as well." Courtney recoils as if she has been physically struck. She presses her hands to her mouth, staring in abject horror as the agents turn her husband around. Derek looks back at her, his face completely drained of color. He looks like a hollow shell of the arrogant man who walked into this courtroom, demanding my money just an hour ago. He opens his mouth to speak, perhaps to apologize, but no sound comes out. The agents do not give him time to find his words. They march him firmly down the center aisle. The gallery spectators shrink back into the wooden benches as they pass, treating Derek like he carries a contagious disease. The heavy oak doors swing open and shut, with a final thud swallowing my brother-in-law into federal custody. The silence that follows is absolute and suffocating. The reality of what just happened hangs over the room, heavy and undeniable. Marcus Vance stands calmly at my side, his posture relaxed, his expression perfectly neutral. He looks at me, and I give him a slow, almost imperceptible nod. The trap we set has worked flawlessly. We let them dig their own graves, gave them the shovels, and watched them jump in. Judge Harrison clears his throat, breaking the tension. He leans forward, resting his forearms on the high mahogany bench. He picks up his wooden gavel and strikes the sound block once. The sharp crack snaps everyone back to attention. Given the extraordinary evidence presented by the respondent and the subsequent federal intervention that has just occurred in my courtroom, I am issuing my ruling immediately, Judge Harrison announces. His voice is loud, angry, and entirely merciless. He picks up the thick stack of emergency medical affidavits, the very documents my family paid thousands of dollars to forge, and holds them up for the court to see. This entire proceeding has been a grotesque abuse of the judicial system, the judge states, glaring down at the petitioner's table. This court finds zero merit in the claims of mental instability, incompetence, or financial incapacity regarding Diana Wilson. The emergency petition for temporary and permanent conservatorship over her person and estate is hereby dismissed with prejudice. He drops the fraudulent documents into his wastebasket with a decisive thud. Dismissed with prejudice means this matter is closed permanently. You will not attempt to refile this garbage in my jurisdiction, nor will you attempt to seize a single penny of the respondent's corporate or personal assets. The medical freeze is denied. The financial freeze is denied. Courtney sags into her chair, burying her face, her shoulders heaving with sobs. Judge Harrison is not finished. His gaze sweeps past Courtney and lands on the gallery behind her, where my mother and father sit frozen in terror. Do not think for one moment that the departure of Mr. Foster concludes the criminal implications of this morning's hearing, Judge Harrison says, his voice dropping to a low octave. He points a finger at Courtney, then moves to point at Linda and Thomas. Mrs. Foster, Mr. and Mrs. Wilson, you came into my courtroom today and swore under oath to a fabricated narrative. You submitted fraudulent medical records. You willingly participated in a coordinated scheme to strip an independent, highly successful woman of her basic civil rights in order to steal her company's operational funds. That is not a simple family misunderstanding. That is a serious crime. My father Thomas turns a sickening shade of pale. The stoic, powerful patriarch facade shatters instantly. He looks around the courtroom, his eyes wide and panicked, finally realizing that his pristine social reputation, his country club standing, and his precious bank accounts are all about to burn to the ground. I am officially ordering the court stenographer to forward the complete transcript of today's sworn testimony to the district attorney's office, Judge Harrison declares, striking his gavel one final time. I am personally recommending that immediate charges be filed against Courtney Foster, Thomas Wilson, and Linda Wilson for perjury, filing false documents, and conspiracy to commit financial fraud. You should all retain criminal defense counsel immediately. This court is adjourned. The judge stands up, his black robe billowing around him, and swiftly exits through the heavy door leading to his private chambers. The moment he is gone, the remaining discipline in the room collapses. The court stenographer gathers her equipment and hurries out. Richard Sterling shoves his papers into his briefcase without a backward glance and practically runs down the aisle, leaving his ruined clients behind. I stand up from the defense table, buttoning my blazer. Marcus hands me my leather briefcase. We step out from behind the table and turn to walk down the center aisle. As we reach the gallery, my mother suddenly scrambles out of her row. She throws herself onto the polished floor, right in my path. As the realization of their absolute ruin sets in, Linda falls to her knees in the aisle, sobbing and begging me for mercy. She pleads for family loyalty, her voice cracking as she grasps at my jacket. I look down at her and coldly reply, I am perfectly sane, Mother, sane enough to know never to fund criminals. Before Linda could reach for me again, the two court bailiffs stepped between us. Ma'am, release her jacket and step back, one of them ordered. Linda's fingers loosened immediately. She looked up at me from the floor, her face streaked with tears, waiting for some sign that I might rescue her from the consequences she had chosen. I gave her none. The bailiffs helped her to her feet and directed Courtney and Thomas to stand as well. Courtney tried to protest, insisting that the family had been manipulated by Derek, but the argument collapsed beneath the weight of her own sworn testimony. Thomas remained silent. The powerful patriarch who had once blocked a doorway and threatened to have me institutionalized could no longer meet my eyes. They were escorted through the secure side exit to await questioning by state investigators regarding the fraudulent medical documents, the false statements made under oath, and the money routed to Judge Harrison's relative. Linda continued calling my name until the heavy door closed behind her. Marcus gathered the remaining files while Daniel joined me at the end of the aisle. Together we walked out of courtroom 3B and descended the broad stone steps toward the street. Below us, federal agents were already guiding Derek toward an unmarked black transport vehicle. His hands were cuffed behind his back, his expensive suit wrinkled and darkened with sweat. Reporters shouted questions from behind the barricades, but he kept his head lowered and offered no response. For a moment, he looked up and saw me standing at the top of the courthouse steps. There was no arrogance left in his face, only the hollow recognition that every person he had manipulated was now evidence against him. An agent lowered Derek's head and guided him into the back of the waiting vehicle. The moment the doors close, the digital world catches up to the physical reality inside courtroom 3B. A local investigative reporter who had been sitting quietly in the back row of the gallery tracking Derek's real estate firm for weeks finishes typing a rapid update on his laptop. Within 15 minutes, the carefully curated social media facade of the perfect family instantly shatters. For years, Courtney had dominated every local platform with stylized photographs of family unity, expensive Thanksgiving dinners, luxury beach vacations, and charity galas, painting a picture of flawless upper-class success. Now those identical images are being pulled by major local news outlets and repurposed alongside flashing red text headlines. The breaking news bulletins describe the spectacular downfall of a corrupt real estate CEO and the immediate exposure of the wealthy family who tried to institutionalize their own independent daughter to cover his tracks and access corporate funds. The contrast is devastating, and the public comment sections transform into an absolute landslide of condemnation. I stand at the defense table watching Marcus Vance methodically slide the 500-page financial report back into his leather briefcase. Daniel stands on my left, his face a calm, stoic mask, though I can see a glimmer of profound relief in his eyes. We built Apex Forensics on a foundation of absolute transparency and unyielding detail, specifically to survive attacks exactly like the one my family tried to execute today. Marcus snaps the silver latches of his briefcase closed and looks at me with a professional nod. "The federal injunction is secure, Diana," he says, his deep voice providing a grounded anchor in the empty, echoing courtroom. "The Department of Justice is taking over the asset tracing now. Your company funds are completely safe, and the state will proceed with the perjury charges by tomorrow morning." I thank him, my voice flat and focused, completely devoid of the fragile emotion my family had tried to exploit. As we turn to leave the room, my phone begins to vibrate continuously against the wood of the table. The silence of the empty court makes the rapid buzzing sound seem incredibly loud. I pick up the device and glance at the screen. The transformation is already occurring in real time. The extended family members, aunts, uncles, and cousins who had spent the last week sending me incredibly hateful, vitriolic text messages calling me a selfish outcast and a delusional failure for hiding away in hotels are currently watching the emergency news broadcasts unfold on their living room television screens. They see Derek in handcuffs, they hear the federal charges, they see their own legal jeopardy if they remain associated with the conspiracy. With frantic, panicked fingers, they begin deleting their previous social media posts and abusive messages, completely blowing up my phone with a continuous stream of groveling apologies, lengthy explanations, and desperate requests for a conversation, begging for forgiveness and safety before the federal investigators expand their search. I look down at the screen as message after message flashes across the glass, none of them moving me. I slide the phone into my blazer pocket without responding to a single one. The story of Diana's courtroom vindication is more than just a dramatic turning point. It is a profound lesson about the realities of toxic family dynamics and the quiet power of self-reliance. For years, Diana's family underestimated her, casting her in the role of the fragile, incompetent scapegoat to elevate their own fragile egos. When driven by greed, they were willing to strip away her fundamental human rights and lock her in a psychiatric facility just to cover their own criminal tracks. But Diana's ultimate triumph didn't come from screaming matches or begging for their love. It came from her unyielding independence. The hardest truth we often have to face is that sharing DNA does not automatically guarantee loyalty, love, or respect. Sometimes the people who are supposed to protect you are the ones setting the traps. Diana teaches us that when dealing with manipulative, narcissistic individuals, your greatest weapon is your own self-sufficiency and emotional composure. She built her empire in silence, gathered her evidence methodically, and allowed her abusers to dig their own graves with their arrogance. True justice isn't always about changing the minds of those who hurt you. It's about standing so firmly in your own truth that their lies simply shatter against it. You do not owe your abusers a lifeline, and setting an immovable boundary is not a betrayal, it is an act of profound self-respect. Have you ever had to stand your ground against a family member who underestimated you or tried to manipulate your truth? How did you find the strength to walk away and build your own success? Share your story in the comments below. If Diana's journey to absolute vindication resonated with you, please hit the like button and subscribe for more stories of resilience, justice, and claiming your own power.